Up smashes can be some of the stronger attacks in the entire game. They kill off the top, which is always fantastic, and unlike other smash attacks, you can do them directly out of shield. But does being good in tournament translate to looking good on screen? Well, today, as voted on by my patrons and members, that's what we're diving into. As usual, we're looking at everything to do with these animations, whether that's technical execution, inspiration, sound design when appropriate, absolutely everything. Let's get into it. This video is sponsored by 8BitDo. When 8BitDo asked me if I'd be interested in trying out their new flagship Ultimate 2 Bluetooth controller for Nintendo Switch and PC, I jumped on it. Because you've actually been watching 8BitDo footage on here for years. I reach for them all the time while I'm recording. Seriously, just Google best Nintendo Switch controllers right now and 8BitDo pops up everywhere. First off, because they feel fantastic. I'm an especially big fan of the Ultimate 2's D-pad. It's super responsive and accurate and clicky, unlike some companies that really should have figured out how to do that by now. And the ability to switch between normal and hair triggers is likewise really hard to give up once you've tried it, especially if you bumper jump a lot like I do. This controller is loaded with nice feeling buttons though, all of which can be assigned to anything you like if you want to switch up your layout, even between games with multiple profiles. And this includes macro and turbo functionality that works really well. A lot of you are Smash players and obviously don't show up to a major rocking macros, but if you want to say, be able to have your opponent actually try and escape in training mode on a vanilla Switch, this is a great way to drive it. Or, you know, just do some shiny hunting in Pokemon, it's great for that too. And with its durable build, including TMR sticks meant to minimize drift and stay precise over time, you've got a lot of hunting, dash dancing, and drifting ahead. The good kind of drifting. Oh, and did I mention 8BitDo is offering 20% off to viewers who use my link? Check it out for yourself in the description and pinned comment below. Starting off with Mario, like we so often do. So one thing I really value with basically all Smash animations is strong moves should feel strong, and I suspect that's going to be a recurring obstacle today because moves that go up need to actively fight against gravity, which means they inherently feel like they're losing a bit of power. Now, the frontal part for Mario, that's not really a problem. You know, he bends back quite a bit like a coiled spring, and then when he comes forward, he's built up quite a bit of momentum, manages to go through a decently strong arc with a bit of recoil to sell it. Hitting with the rear part of the move, though, there's just no getting around how weak that feels. It obviously kills quite well from both sides. This feels fine, but gameplay-wise, this may be just as lethal. But it doesn't feel like it should be. There just hasn't been time for his head to build up any proper momentum. And then Dr. Mario's is obviously the exact same thing, except that it launches at a completely different angle, and this time around the rear half, I would say actually makes more sense. It doesn't make any literal sense for your opponent to be scooped up by your head and carried along with it for a bit, but at least you can understand the flow of momentum. If you hit them with his forehead though, they go over his shoulder, and that just feels completely wrong. The hitbox on this should really send at different trajectories depending on what part of it you hit with, because that just, it doesn't work. And then we have Luigi, who's the equivalent to Mario and Dr. Mario, but I would say executed worse, if anything. His head doesn't follow the same arc, and it's a little more lazily done. There's just not as much commitment behind it. Luigi's a character that I want to feel very slapstick and cartoony and over the top, and you know, he's hiding his face so he doesn't get to do any kind of anticipatory expression or anything. And he's not doing any kind of funny expression when he comes down. And again, he's putting less force into it than Mario and Dr. Mario do. If anything, this should be more exaggerated, not less. The way the foot stomp and the head swing line up just feels a little bit off as well. The foot stomp, I feel like, should have a bit more leeway, so it creates kind of a counterbalance mechanism for his head to really be able to whip forward. I think technically speaking, it's actually about the same timing as Mario, but because Mario does a bigger swing, it obscures it a bit more, and that larger arc almost lets you buy the opposite effect a bit, where his head is swinging so fast that his foot needs to come forward to catch himself. I don't get that from Luigi. So Mario is going to get B tier, I think. And then Luigi and Dr. Mario. Now, this through line of the headbutt, at first glance, it might seem a little bit weird for these characters all to headbutt. What does this have to do with Mario? But if you think about it a bit more, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I kind of get what it's doing here. But it is an animation that inherently comes with some problems, and it gets worse as you go through the characters. And is it just so iconic and so Mario-esque that all three of them needed to adhere to it so closely? I don't know. It's a bit of a weird signature technique for them all to have, honestly. And these other two both have flaws that Mario's doesn't, so I think that actually puts them both into C tier. Wario's got something similar, but better. When I was talking about wishing Luigi had a more exaggerated version of the attack, this is the kind of thing I meant. Look at this, the lean back is about the same, but at the end, he actually almost hits his head on the ground. That is the kind of commitment I'm looking for, and it actually makes a lot of sense for Wario because he also gets an outrageously big head, so of course it's going to bring some more weight into the equation that he's going to have to topple down on. Now, in moment-to-moment gameplay, you don't see it necessarily so much, but you do feel it, and that's what the point of this whole body-breaking thing often is. A lot of Smash characters do this. Wario rarely does it, though, and it does help his animations out. And also helping it out is if you actually land the attack and go into hit lag, the freeze frames are his big head. It's generally only there for a couple of frames, but if you actually hit someone with it, it feels like you're jamming a wrecking ball into them. And the rear hit, again, inherently has the same lack of momentum problem as the others, but it's even mitigated a bit here because he's transporting much more mass in around the same amount of frames, which if anything means it's going to generate more momentum. This approach is so effective that it feels heavier than the others when it whiffs, even though he has a much more cartoony, lighthearted, like comedic whiff sound. Very video gamey, but it works. That's gonna go up in A tier, I think. Might as well wrap the headbutts up while we're here. We got Jigglypuff, Pichu, Mr. Game & Watch, and sure, Piranha Plant can be on the team, why not? So Jigglypuff's design deliberately underemphasizes her ground moves, and that means that her up smash is a bit slower than the other headbutts, and that's allowed to impart a bit more of a sense of power, which is nice because basically no other decision behind this one does. I like her facial expressions going from very oh no to very serious, but her body's a sphere, and what she rotates around is barely even off the center of it for whatever reason. It means that she barely gets to move her body at all. And obviously, if you're hitting someone with what's essentially just your body because she doesn't even really have a separate head, that's a bit of a problem if you want to move to feel strong. She does lean forward a fair amount to her credit, but still, there's just nothing actually moving. And Jigglypuff is also the balloon Pokemon. Look at her idle animation. She can barely keep herself on the ground. And to me, that makes it feel kind of weird that she starts off with this big wind-up spring motion and then immediately just gets anchored to the floor, which her kit in general is heavily not supposed to feel like. If you ask me, this would be way more effective if it actually launched her into the air when she used it. And because it's not a particularly emphasized move on her kit, again, there's room to do something like that. It's not like she would lose a lot. We've seen that kind of thing pop up in other platform fighters where it often feels very stylish and distinctive and gives the move a lot of personality, and what could be more appropriate for Jigglypuff's personality than big angry attack that puts you up in the air? Because as is, I just really don't know what this is even doing here. It's not a Kirby holdover, for example, because back in Smash 64 she was a Kirby clone and she carries some of that forward, and you know, I guess fair enough, but she's ripping off Mario instead. And I don't get why. Pichu is kind of a funny one to analyze because it seems like the animators are actually doing a lot right here. There's a pretty good lean back, especially if you let it charge up, and then a nice, really strong push forward as well. Pichu's head almost scrapes into the ground. It's got some fluidity and bounce to it. I'm always happy to see that, especially for more cartoony characters. So this should feel really satisfying and powerful, and yet it still comes off as a bit stiff. I think it's because right at the end, Pichu catches itself a little bit unnaturally. Again, it leans forward a good amount, but I think this is one where its head should be honestly smacking into the floor. Now, that's debatable because Pichu hurts itself specifically with electrical attacks, and you may say, well, you know what? I really want animations that feel more painful to both parties if the electricity comes out. And yeah, I can understand that, but at the same time, have you seen Dash Attack's animation? Definitely bails there, and I feel like up smash would benefit a bit from that as well. Now, the other point you could make is, well, maybe up smash should feel a bit stiffer and less strong because it doesn't use electricity, which means it's also the weak one. But generally speaking, I'll give a move bonus points if it ends up feeling stronger than it actually is. I'll rarely do the opposite. And then we have Mr. Game & Watch's headbutt, and one thing I'm not actually noticing until right now, I guess Mr. Game & Watch is not an ambidextrous character, because if I do it from this side, you can see the face shield for the diving helmet, but if I do it from this side, you can't. Most of his moves make him look completely ambidextrous, but I guess that's just a byproduct of the silhouetting they've got going on. Beyond that, what do you really want me to say? There are literally 2 frames to this entire animation. One point I can tack on is if they're gonna insist on this carrying a lot of weight, they could probably have that second frame where he's leaned forward. Again, lean forward more. This is stronger than it looks, and that's just a trait that to some extent you have to accept with a lot of Game & Watch's moves. That's just simply the nature of how he's animated, and for the most part, you know, fair enough, but he could lean into this a bit more. It might be a sprite directly ripped out of the Game & Watch games, but If it is, maybe it shouldn't have been. And I'm not even sure it is. And then we get to Piranha Plant, who does have some more pure headbutt moves, but for up smash specifically, it's this bite here. This is another move where the first word that comes to mind for me is stiff, and I think some of that just comes down to that initial chambering animation. It's really not as far down in the plant as it could be, even if you let it charge. And I think my proof is comparing it to Long Stem Strike, where it just feels way more fluid, because Piranha Plant in general is actually a fairly fluidly animated character. There's a nice elasticity to a lot of these, and then it's just like lock in. I do like this little head shake at the end though. It's funny, I'll give it that. Does it do the head shake if it hits someone? Let's see. Yep, okay. I was about to say, I don't know why I thought I wouldn't do that, but you know what? I do, because to me, this kind of inherently feels like it should be a hit grab of some kind. If you whiff it, it feels like a proper bite, but if you land it, the freeze frames are when the mouth is still open, and there's not really any kind of proper transport into the mouth. I know it's not always necessarily a full-on bite in the Mario games, but that's clearly what they're going for here, because again, if you whiff, it sounds like a bite, but if you actually hit someone, it doesn't have a real proper chomp sound effect or anything, it just sounds like generic blade slashes. And yet, I don't know what to tell you, that's clearly supposed to look like a bite. So yeah, I'm feeling more of a C tier for that one too. Pichu C tier, Mr. Game & Watch C tier, and then Jigglypuff, you know what, honestly, F, this is an attack I would be very happy to see just completely reworked in Smash 6. It really doesn't have a lot of reason to be here. Let's get Kirby in there. This is the first flip kick or bicycle kick we're looking at, another move type that inherently has a bit of a fighting gravity problem. This one is done pretty competently though. Nice wind up here, and then that rear leg is allowed to move very far, very fast. It travels in essentially a complete circle in only a couple of frames, but the particle effect does a lot of heavy lifting, letting your eye smoothly track what the motion is intended to be, while still letting the move be fast enough to convey a real sense of proper rotational momentum. The pose he goes into is nice, and then there's just a little bit of Looney Tunes gravity right at the end. He goes into slightly more hang time than he should actually get, which lets him plop down satisfyingly. I will say the get up after the plop is a bit abrupt looking, but all the way until then, it's nice. Feels pretty good to hit with too. They give him that really nice bassy melee attack sound. This one does have a sour spot on it, as you'd expect from the animation. It's not the most inherently intuitive sour spot though. Compare that to Fox, for example, who probably has the most famous bicycle kick, at least competitively. You see, that's more how I'd expect a sour spot like that to launch you. Obviously, they work differently for balance purposes, and that takes priority here, but it would just be nice if there was a bit of a visual indicator. There's another nice, very smooth circular arc in only a couple of frames. I like that. In Fox's case, they even tuck the non-attacking leg behind the rest of him so that you can really get all the emphasis on the one that's actually doing the damage. That's a nice touch. I don't necessarily love the actual launch off, though, especially if you charge it where he goes onto the ground here. I'm just not really buying that he's actually leaving the ground there. What's actually going on there? So he's on the ground, obviously, charging up, and then I let go. He starts the attack. So it's all just momentum generated from the foot. I guess that's okay. It is a nice exaggerated pose, but it does mean at full scale and speed if you're not doing any proper charging on it. It makes the entire thing have a bit of like a catchy feeling at the start to it. Like he just hiccups into position a little bit awkwardly. Now, admittedly, that's a very minor nitpick, although if you don't like those, what are you here for? The thing that puts me off about this much more, though, is the landing animation. This is one of, if not the most leaned on up smashes in the entire game, and to compensate for that, it's also one of the least safe. You can tell if someone's inexperienced in the matchup if they whiff this in your face and you don't prepare a huge punish afterwards. And yet I can't really blame anyone who doesn't, because I don't think this animation really conveys just how laggy it actually is. This feels like he should be hitting the ground much heavier. I would say the execution is definitely a bit stronger with Falco overall though, because I do like that contrast. Pretty solid execution on the double kick too. Both kicks travel in a nice arc, and they're careful not to block Falco's actual torso from either side, so you get a pretty nice clean read of the character. Chambering pose is a little bit weird. What exactly is he even doing there? Okay, so he's got his right leg raised up. Is that the one that actually does the kicking? Yes, but he comes all the way back around and converts it into a hook kick. Okay, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like that leg could be pushed out a bit more to really help whip around and sell that though, because even here it can be a bit hard to tell exactly what's going on. At a full gameplay scale and speed, no way could I have told you that was a hook kick. And the other question is, in older Smash games, he had a bicycle kick like Fox did, and I'm always happy to make Falco more of his own thing. Don't get me wrong, if you want another Melee Falco analog, there are a million unofficial projects where you can play that. But Falco's supposed to be the more hot-headed, timid, cocky, arrogant, flashy character compared to Fox. Does a double kick where he no longer does a full-on backflip communicate that? It's kind of up in the air. Personally, I'd still say Fox's looks a bit more technical and fancy. And then we have Wolf, and I'll say if you're gonna have an up smash with these scooping hitboxes, I think it makes much more sense to have it baked into the actual character animation. You know, Wolf does a whirlwind kick and his legs himself bring you into the rest of him, as opposed to someone like Marth, for example, where they come up with a strong base pose first and then they need to invent just a little magical clouds of dust that actually pop people into it. This works better for me, and it's a very well done technical animation overall, but I will say, first off, it's just a kind of funny thing to give a character like Wolf. Like, I know Star Fox is not the most hardcore video game series ever made or anything, but Wolf is a villain in it and he's generally played pretty straight, so I do think it's a little funny to have him just breakdancing on you here. And they gave the attack a lot of squash and stretch as well, which works very well in many different contexts. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad here, but the fact that the freeze frames are focused on his feet so much, so you do actually get to see that crazy stretch linger for a bit in real time, like this here, it is noticeable, and yeah, it just feels, again, a bit out of place on a character like this. He was a very goofily animated character in Brawl overall, and when they brought him into Ultimate, they cleaned a lot of that up, but for whatever reason, this is the one that needed to stick around. And the other thing that's kind of strange to me, which is actually more of an indictment of Fox and Falco than anything, is this is by far the least leggy of any of them, and it also has by far the heaviest landing animation, go figure. So going back to Kirby, I think that's going to be another B tier. It's well done, but what do you want from me? It's such a simple concept. Fox goes in B tier again. This one could be A tier if that landing animation was handled better. Falco gets a B tier, and Wolf gets a B tier. This could be an A tier, I think maybe on another character. It just, I can't wrap my head around it for him. Let's get in there with Marth. And might as well get the whole gang. Yeah, so like I said, it's kind of funny that you have this pose that just goes straight up with the sword, but they still need to actually be able to hit people, so they have to add this other stuff around his feet. Let's try and show that off a bit better. Here you go. Like I also said though, it's a really nice strong pose. There's some great upwards force on that one, even if the lead hand does have a bit of stank on it while he's winding up. Okay, if I'm being real, his chamber animation as a whole actually looks kind of funky, but again, once it's actually fired, all good. It feels good to hit with all the time, providing you don't get the whiff. But of course, the real fun is hitting the tipper. Something, of course, Lucina can't do, which basically always makes me prefer Marth's animations to at least some extent, but other than that, it's business as usual, including the kind of awkward pose before she stabs. Roy and Chrom, of course, have variants on this, and overall, you know what? I think I actually prefer theirs. To begin with, I like this pose a lot more. It makes sense for them to have a bit more of a stronger, defined silhouette compared to Marth and Lucina's more elegant playstyle, but at the same time, it just doesn't look goofy in the same way. It actually looks quite stoic and cool before the initial stab up. Now, not dealing the damage with the stab instantly because this is a multi-hit does have some trade-offs. It means that there's not nearly the same satisfying, just instant punchiness that Marth and Lucina has, but you gain a lot for that. You hold the pose for longer, so it's emphasized more, and the particle effects do, of course, obscure that to some extent, but I don't really find myself minding. These are cool-looking particle effects, and this is a nice sort of framework to tack them onto. And the multi-hit nature also means that the foot hitboxes don't really suffer the same problem. People pretty much always get scooped up into it successfully, and you can honestly even think of it as more canonically justified. Like, you know, there's energy being drawn from the air into the sword to create that flame, and his opponent gets dragged with it. It feels good to land too. Although if you don't land it, there's a very nice little bit of recoil right at the end of the initial flare there, and you do lose that with the extra hit lag. I feel like they could emphasize that a bit more so it's more visible inside the chaos, because as is, to some extent, it just kind of feels like he's being randomly let go from the sword. And of course, this exact same thing also applies to Chrom. You've got that better posing compared to Marth and Lucina, and you've got the particle effects that are very visible even if it doesn't connect. I do find myself really liking this Wind one too. Now, I'm as much of a sucker for a fire swordsman as anyone else is, but wind powers are a little bit more unique. There aren't as many Smash characters or just, you know, video game characters in general who have wind powers as there are fire powers, it seems like. And these are well done. They match the flow of the stab well, and I love this little ripple of distortion right at the end. They sound good too, although I do wish they were a bit more windy. You do get some gust in there. It's more noticeable if you whiff. But on hit, a lot of that is overpowered by just kind of a generic blade slash. I think Marth and Lucina are getting B tier, and Roy and Chrom A. If I remember right, back when I did my very first take on this animation ranking concept over on MockRock like half a decade ago, I think Roy actually got honorable mention for up smash, but I've spent a lot more time looking at smash animations on this channel since then, and those small technical details, they do come into play more than they used to. Oh, and while we're here, this is the more real-world version of Marth and Lucina's because it does not have foot hitboxes on it. You need to hit them from below. He also commits to it way harder. Look at how much further he leans down here, and it does look a little bit goofy in its own right, but I can definitely buy it more. And then when he goes up, it's a very strong thrust, and then he does more of a flourish afterwards. Very strong silhouette, essentially the entire way through. Now, this little move he does back to idle here, it's a little slidey, kind of video gamey, but whatever. It actually looks pretty different on this side too, but the end result is still about as strong. Yeah, I actually prefer it on that side because you can see his facial expression. It looks more heroic. It feels pretty good to land really all the time. But of course, the real fun comes from getting the crit. How nice would it have been to land that the first time? There it is. Yeah, as much as I don't like that mechanic, it is a satisfying hit sound, and this is a strong pose to linger on for it. You know what, I'm just starving for an S tier at this point, and this is such a big upgrade to Marth and Lucina's that I think I'll give it up. And might as well cover Shulk, who kinda does the same thing. So do Simon and Richter, technically, if we want to get really loose with it. And I guess Sora's in that camp. Yeah, so we do have the upward stab, but this is a much stranger, more original take on that notion. At full scale and speed, it's honestly a little hard to tell what he's even doing. This is like the finisher pose for the other characters, but then he comes down and then launches that massive blade of energy from the Monado up. And I don't know if this is taken from Xenoblade or not, I've never played it, but I don't really get it. And if you look at how he actually uses the move, they're so close to putting the concept together, it could look like he's creating an earthquake with that initial slam into the ground that then scoops the opponent into the blade. From this side, I think it'll make a little bit more sense, you know, slam, and then the opponent gets launched from that force of the hilt striking the earth into the actual final hit. But I don't even think that's what they're actually going for because there's no kind of earthquake particle effect. But if they did, I think I would really like it. It sounds pretty good and feels pretty good to hit with, but I prefer the sound when it whiffs. This is very distinctive and laser swordy. When you actually hit someone with it, it tends to, again, sort of overwhelm the more unique sound design with a generic blade slash. And changing Monado arts doesn't actually impact anything. I think it'd be great if for his biggest attacks, if you switch to Smash or Buster Art in particular, it also changed the sound effect to that more like big reverbed hit. Simon and Richter take a page from Hero. They have none of that foot hitbox stuff going on whatsoever. The trade-off in their case has nothing to do with critical hits and everything to do with the move being f***ing enormous. I really like the way the whip is handled on the way down. Now, it's not the absolute most realistic physics on the planet, obviously, but there is a concerted effort to have it, sort of follow a path that leads into a coiling motion. You know, he is very obviously controlling it as it starts to lose height. He doesn't allow it to just drop freely. And if you notice that little bit of funniness as it's coming down, don't worry about it. That's interpolation that happens when you put the game to quarter speed. At full speed, that is just not a thing. Very nice exaggerated chamber pose on this side where he's staring over his own pecs. The Belmonts are walking tanks, and this does play into that well. The arm that's actually holding the whip may be just the slightest bit too exaggerated, though. I like exaggeration, but oh, that looks painful. And actually from this side, I would kind of say the same thing about both arms. Those shoulder blades just look straight up dislocated. Again, we're back to body breaking, and that's nowhere near as exaggerated as Wario's big head, and at motion, it's totally fine. But if you're gonna freeze on it, it does end up looking just a little wonky. Now, one point of unambiguous praise, God, I love the Belmont sound design in Ultimate. And of course, Simon's there right alongside Richter. This is literally the exact same animation. Sora, so this is a very strong smash attack, and it's one he leans on a lot too. It's very common to see him finish a stock off with some kind of neutral air combo into an up smash finisher. And that's a shame because those combos lose a lot of punch from the fact that this animation just does not feel strong. It's playful, it's whimsical, and that fits Sora, but his arm doesn't really thrust up all that fast. His rear arm doesn't have to counterbalance him all that much. His rear leg does end up coming off the ground, but there's a delay there, so it's not like he's putting in so much force that he's like lifted into the air by his own strength. It's just kind of a nice little ending pose he does to make him look a little more, again, playful. The silhouette's not nearly as well defined as some of these we've looked at, especially if you hit someone. where he just kind of disappears into a cloud of stuff, and the sound design's not really doing him a lot of favors either. It thankfully doesn't use this horrible dinky little thing that so much of his sound design takes directly from Kingdom Hearts, and I think that's much worse than... But at the same time, this magical sounding frequency shifted spark, that stays the dominant sound effect even if you hit someone. And yeah, it just doesn't sound that strong. And you know, you could say, hey, Sora's a Disney character, his moves aren't supposed to feel like they hit nearly as hard as some characters, but I'm not sure that's what they're going for, because he has other moves that manage to maintain that same floatiness and playfulness, but still feel like they pack some punch. This one is just kind of a miss for me. I think if he ended up in that final pose, but just put more force into getting there, it would actually be a winner, because it's another upward stab that does have a lot of distinctiveness and personality behind it, but more than anything else, this is an attack animation. It needs to really nail the attack portion. So Shulk is going in C tier, and that one's a real shame. It's literally one earthquake particle effect from A at a minimum. The Belmonts are B, and Sora I'm willing to just let slip into B because, again, it does at least have a lot of personality to it, which I do appreciate. I just wish it was a better actual attack. Oh, if you want an up smasher's up smash, though, best up smash in the entire game on a character who has this kind of range. Make it make sense. And you know what? If you're gonna be this blatantly bullshit, you should look good while you're doing it, and I'll be damned, this looks pretty good. There's a nice contrast between the exaggerated hang time she gets from the kick itself and how insanely fast her legs actually travel in that arc. It allows it to feel very exaggerated and dramatic, but that hang time does not get in the way of it feeling punchy either. And this one has a pretty heavy landing on it too, which makes basically perfect sense. She's landing from fairly high up after that initial jump, but it's also not the most laggy up smash in the entire world, even though it definitely should be for the record, and the way they've animated that on the way down sells everything essentially perfectly. Even her final little get up back into idle here has more heft behind it than a lot of Smash animations do, which is one of my single biggest recurring issues with so many of them. And it feels quite good to land too. Those hit lag frames are at the very start where she hasn't quite gotten full momentum yet, but because Min Min herself just whips her entire body so fast, you don't really tend to notice it that much at full speed. And of course, if she lands the upwards portion, that's just not a consideration at all. And of course, it's also the only up smash in the entire game that has a reflector on it because it absolutely needed that on top of coming out on frame 8 and reaching halfway into the sky. I hate this move. I just can't bring myself to hate its animation though. S tier. Yoshi, another bicycle kick for the road. This is a very straightforward take on the bicycle kick, which is in line with Yoshi's very simple moveset in Smash, but sometimes I almost feel like it's too simple, and that does apply here. This is a new move he got in Smash 4, and it's not like his old one was particularly mind-blowing either, but it was a bit more distinctive, I would say. You know, it separated him from the rest of the pack, but also tied him into Mario and Luigi. This just doesn't really feel like all that much, and it's not poorly implemented. It's clearly modeled more on Fox's, but has a bit of a bounciness to it that I do appreciate, but at the same time, it feels a bit less heavy hitting, which I guess is fair. This one isn't nearly as much of a stable kill move. And the big feet combined with that sound effect do make it pretty satisfying to hit with, and the sour spot makes a lot of intuitive sense. And again, it's not poorly done, I just have a bit of trouble justifying its existence. Like, if they're gonna go through all the trouble of giving him a brand new attack, why this one? I just don't really know what it's bringing to the table. The chamber pose is working for me though. That's a really strong back arch that makes the rear foot flying through afterwards feel pretty clean. But overall, yeah, it's another B tier. See, Mii Brawler, on the other hand, this time around, I 100% understand why he has a bicycle kick. If you want a generic feeling move, here you go. This one does hit hard, but not necessarily insanely hard. If it whiffs, you can kind of tell that, because this overall just feels a little thin and wispy to me. I'm sure costumes can change that feel to some extent, but Mii Brawler doesn't really stretch his limbs all that much. In fact, you know what I say not that much for this? Is his foot getting any bigger? I'm not sure it is, and even if it does, the particle effect completely obscures that. And yeah, this is why they do that kind of limb elongation or limb growth thing with Smash characters, because if you take it away, the attack really does lose some substance. This is just so spindly feeling compared to something like Yoshi with those big feet. It's a shame because I really like this wind-up. I really like the bit of hang time he gets at the end there. The getup is pretty solid overall as well, but the main part of the attack is just not really all that fun to look at. I think it's technically well done enough overall to let it stay in B tier, I guess, but it's not really that impressive. I guess this is a good time to do the other Miis then, but first. Okay, so for Samus, what I can say about this is it's a fairly distinctive feeling up smash. There's not really anything else in the game except for Mii Gunner that does this. I still have a hard time bringing myself to actually like it, though. There's barely even a point to doing a charge up animation with this because all the actual power just comes out of the barrel itself. It's not like she's putting a lot of effort into it with her arm, really any effort at all. And it's just so lazily done. Maybe they're going for nonchalant, but her kit overall doesn't really have this problem. In fact, this barely even feels like something from Metroid. I think it's technically supposed to be the plasma beam. That's the justification I've heard for a lot of these explosive style moves that she uses, but it's not my favorite way to honor the Metroid series in Smash, and this is one of the more egregious misses. From a Smash gameplay perspective, this actually makes more sense. I think this is supposed to be the classic zoner anti-air style move. You know, you threaten your opponent with a projectile, they try to jump over it, and then you hit them with something because her forward air is also very much designed like that. This just doesn't do much for me, especially because if you actually land it, that final hit has the same problem of Roy and Chrom, where it just kind of feels like they're randomly popping out at the end, except cranked up 1000%. Still bugs me less than Dark Samus though, and this is not quite the same animation as Samus's. It's got a slightly different and slightly cooler looking wind-up, to be fair, and then the actual firing animation itself has a bit more distinctiveness at the end too. You've got that raised leg that it then uses to go back into that floating idle position. So, you know, props to the devs for iterating on it at least a bit. Doesn't stop that final result from feeling just as limp though. So Samus and Dark Samus are both C tier, borderline F for different reasons between them. Samus because at least it's memorable, Dark Samus because at least it's slightly different than Samus's. Which, of course, brings us to Mii Gunner. Now, I get it, okay? They really want you to look at this character and think Samus. She was the first ever zoner in the game. The Mii characters are heavily modeled on the original Smash 64 roster. I do understand. That still doesn't mean I'm at all happy to see the move show up again, is what I would say, except I actually think it's done much better here than it is on either of the Samuses. Look at this, she's going into an actual proper power stance here with some real tension behind it, and then that tension gets unloaded very well, and then there's a proper recoil animation at the end. Her arm moves more throughout the entire thing, the explosives cover up more of her body, which actually makes them look decidedly more dangerous and dominant in the animation, and yes, that extra effort does make it feel much better to land. Oh, well, she's not some 6-foot-plus alien hybrid bounty hunter in power armor, she's just a human girl. Of course she needs to put more effort into reining in the recoil of her gun. Okay, well imagine if that 6-foot-plus alien hybrid bounty hunter in power armor also had to put effort into reining in the recoil of her gun. Think of how strong that would make the gun feel. Not to mention the planet-devouring super entity, it's insane that Mii Gunner absolutely runs laps around both of them here. So now we of course need to talk about the links. This is a long-running attack that has very little to do with The Legend of Zelda other than the fact that, you know, Link does blade slash combos here and there, but it has become, I would say, something of a fan favorite. It's a very common one that you see casual players notoriously spam online because it's always been huge and hit hard, and I would say Ultimate's take on it feels pretty damn fun to land too. You've got this triple slash here, and this first one is a fairly straightforward just sword arc over the head. This part of the animation could be an up tilt all by itself, but it's well done. Good anticipation and follow through on it. And then the sword blade comes down, and how smooth is the arc into the second one? Yeah, it's not bad. It does feel a little bit clunky, not necessarily quite as smooth as I was originally thinking, but at speed it's so quick that you really have a hard time noticing it. Same with the funny pose at the end. This is not a charging pose, he never ever lingers on it, so who cares? And then from there, it sets up actually quite strongly into that final jumping attack. The jump feels maybe a little bit desynced, and it could be a slight bit more exaggerated maybe, but it's a small jump with a pretty exaggerated landing that does make it feel like you put effort into it. And at full gameplay scale and speed, which of course is what we ultimately really care about, I would say that actually any semblance of that jump still sells the impact pretty well. I don't really miss the lack of exaggeration. It's just such a whirlwind of blades, and if it didn't line up properly, if something looked off about it, that's when I would really want to slow things down to figure out what was off. But ultimately, if the final take on it feels good, which this one does, the small stuff is kind of whatever. And then young Link, of course, who's still holding down the left-handed version of it like adult Link did up until Ultimate. This is a very similar concept. The first two hits are doing mostly the same thing. The final hit has more of a flourish behind it, which I do appreciate, and it matches this take on the character. You know, a little more explicitly acrobatic than Link is often portrayed as. But even though it's doing a lot of the same stuff, and I like what they added, this just doesn't really hit the same for me. Young Link is not as powerful a character as Link is. So obviously this was never going to hit as hard, fair enough, but it still just feels so much weaker. To some extent, again, this was inevitable because the blade is shorter, along with his limbs, of course, but the fact that the blade is relatively so much thicker and the particle effects are more evenly distributed. If you look at Link's particle effects, there's a heavy emphasis on the tip of the sword, which of course is the fastest moving part, so it really feels like it's whipping around. For young Link, he just straight up doesn't have that whatsoever, and it really makes a difference. It feels, again, less whippy, less sharp. He's doing a lot of stuff right. His chamber pose here is actually way more exaggerated and poised looking than Link's is, but the final result just can't stick the landing the same way, and yeah, again, to some extent some of that was inevitable, and to some extent some of that's even justified, but I really think the particle effects are not pulling their weight. So Link, A tier, and young Link, B tier. On a pure character animation technical level, I think it's just as well done, but I don't get the same kind of visceral punch from it. And if we're reviewing a fighting game's animations, that's kind of a big deal. And now we can talk about Mii Sword Fighter, who's clearly pulling from Link, but with 2 hits instead of 3. And you know what? Maybe he should have kept the 3rd, or at least kept sword slashes that are properly perpendicular to the camera, because as is, he does these on more of a diagonal, and that makes them lose so much presence on screen. Might have been done for balance purposes, considering the lack of a 3rd hit, I guess would make this a bit less laggy than the other Links have to deal with, but I don't know, I have a hard time justifying this. It looks weird, it looks worse, it's a nonsensical tactical decision, and I hate to say that because I like a lot of the other stuff he's doing. Again, he actually puts more effort into this than the proper Links do. He's off the ground the entire time, but you know, it looks cool. On the flip side, though, it also makes him less grounded, less rooted, and therefore deliver less of a sense of power. The landing that he does at the end here is pretty decently heavy, but the spring back up at the end, once again, we're back to just completely weightless territory, especially at full scale and speed. He looks good up until immediately after that palm touches the ground. I will say, though, this doesn't feel bad to land. You get 2 hits that are both delivered in the air and have a fair amount of hit lag on them, and the end result is some pretty good hang time, and that is fun. It's a B tier's worth of fun, though. Now, with Mii Sword Fighter, I often complain about the fact that his moves are modeled off Link's rather than Marth's. It still doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. For this move in particular, though, you know, Marth's up smash is a bit of a throwaway move, and Mii Sword Fighter has kind of a hybridization between it and Link in some aspects. You know, it functions more like Link's, which is the more fun, distinctive sword attack, but it's quicker and skinnier than Link's, which moves it more akin to Marth's. And that's fine. If that was the actual concrete vision they had, I get it. But it does end up in kind of an awkward middle ground for me, where it's not nearly as sensible or elegant and smooth as Marth's, and it's not as much fun to use as Link's. But the concept is there at least. And we should bring Toon Link in here. Toon Link, of course, does not get the 3-hit flurry, he just does a single hit, and man, that is a nice sword arc. Or at least it is throughout most of the move. The particle effect does seem to kind of fizzle out at the end, and the last few frames are maybe a bit jerky. Yeah, his sword arm stays stiff as if he's still cutting long after the particle effect disappears, so this almost looks to me like it should be a spiral cut, but then it's just kind of lopped off in the middle. It doesn't ruin it for me by any means, it's honestly a pretty subtle thing, but I think if that particle effect hung on for even just a couple more frames, it would make the entire thing feel way smoother. Or even more than a couple frames. Yeah, look at this. How nice would it be if there was a full second cut at the end there? God, that would make it feel so much more distinctive, because, again, for the most part, it's well animated, but it is a sword slash overhead. We have plenty of these. We have other ones on his kit. Toon Link can actually put both these moves into the same combo, and I mean, if you didn't know the game that well, you might not even be able to tell he's doing 2 different attacks there. And of course, like with so many of Toon Link's moves, the ultimate sound design. God, it's sharp. Sound effect aside, which I've seen some defense for over the years, although I definitely do get the impression most people are on my side there, this really isn't poorly implemented. But it is like, okay, let's take Link, transplant this move onto a more exaggerated, cartoony version of him, and then extract all the fun out of it. And for that, it's a C tier. Who says overhead sword arcs can't be fun, though? This move's main job was to hit like a truck. And it does. It does feel a little stiffer than I necessarily want it to, and some of that is just how Ganondorf is supposed to be moving around. You know, they did make a conscious effort to make him feel more fluid and Ultimate compared to Smash 4. God, please never make me go back to that again. But the sword always feels just a little bit too much in control for my liking, and yes, that's realistic, and yes, as the big strong guy in the series, that's exactly what he should be aspiring to do, is control the sword, but there's a reason video games essentially never adhere to that. You're not tangibly connected to the world. Everything you're feeling is vicarious, so they need to give you a lot of vicarious stuff to feel. And for this animation here, Ganondorf's arm never even fully hyperextends. His elbow always stays at least a little bit bent. And that's not a mistake on the animator's part by any means, that's a very conscious choice, again, to make him feel stronger stronger and more in control of the blade. But similar to Samus, okay, but imagine a guy this big and strong still struggling to contain the sword's momentum. And for his forward smash, for example, they lean into that more. There's still some modicum of control over it, but if you look at this is a proper hyperextension of that leading arm. And the blade goes almost parallel when it first hits the ground too, and then it's allowed to wiggle around quite a bit with recoil. And you do that with up smash, and it technically does the same thing, but it's not committing to it nearly the same way. And you can see that at the beginning of the attack, this is essentially, again, perpendicular to the camera, but by the time he's done, he's wound it around to be a bit more diagonal. So again, it just looks like the momentum is not nearly getting away from him as much as I'd like. Yeah, just look at how much his arm is crunched in there, and I suspect they might be doing the Cloud neutral air thing, honestly, where in Smash 4, Cloud's neutral air was infamously just ridiculously big, and their solution for balancing that in Ultimate was to have him just awkwardly scrunch his arm for the rest of time. And Ganondorf has a comparable sword and longer limbs, and this is already one of the biggest smash attacks in the entire game, so I kind of suspect that might be the plan. And contextually, it does work more for Ganondorf than it would for essentially any other character in the entire game. Again, this is basically the embodiment of pure power. Literally, in canon, he's the Triforce of Power holder, but I still wish they'd found a way to let him really let loose. Compare that to Ike, who got there first. Yeah, he feels like he's committing to the swing more, and it's not hard to see why. Yeah, that elbow fully hyperextends, and that sword really properly slams into the ground. Ike is not nearly Ganondorf strong in his series canon, but another very strong character, and this is a situation where he is just barely in control of the blade by the time it actually touches down. And I think the move benefits from it. To me, this feels a lot more satisfying to actually use. Or at least it would, if not for the sound design. It's not the worst, but this is my annual complaint about how much better Brawl was segment. So Ike, easy S tier. Ganondorf, I'm debating between A and S. The fans definitely want S for this one, I know. But I consider it a slightly inferior animation to Ike's, and I also subtract some points for being kind of a rip-off of Ike's. It's a loose rip-off, the animation concept's not identical, but it's pretty close. If you actually land it though, it's still one of the most satisfying attacks to actually connect in the entire game. Those very opaque, thick particle effects do a lot for it too. So okay, I'll let that be the tiebreaker. Can you believe this guy used to share an up smash with him? Now, Captain Falcon's the one who maintained that double-footed kick the entire time, or at least since Melee in Smash 64 it was different. And there's a big deviation with this one for me, where if you don't land it, it feels kind of like Mii Brawlers in the sense that it's kind of insubstantial and wispy. Again, his limbs don't really grow in any substantial way, and this is a move where I do think that hurts it quite a bit, but then if you land it, that feels so much better. But even then, a couple caveats. First off, the lack of a substantial sound effect on that first initial launcher hit. That does bring it down a little. And also the hitboxes. This is a buffed move. So for balance purposes, I understand this is a pretty useful move in Captain Falcon's arsenal now, and it wasn't beforehand, but still, what the hell is this? Now, looking at it in slow motion, I'm realizing for the first time here, Captain Falcon and Falco do essentially the same thing. Is that why Falco got his new up smash? He's referencing Captain Falcon. I really don't know how I could misconstrue that as anything else now that I'm really looking at it. It's a big foot lift into a hook kick, into a roundhouse kick as you do a jump over. What else could that be? I actually don't hate it though. They do kind of have similar personalities in a lot of ways. Anyways, it's a B tier. Fun and kind of iconic, I guess, but far from even the most iconic move on Captain Falcon's kit, and it's got some pretty substantial flaws. What about Incineroar? The wiki tells me he's doing a double axe handle here. I don't know what that means, but it looks very wrestling-ish, and I do like the wrestling moveset. This is decently exaggerated. It looks strong. It looks pretty committal. I do feel like that bend could have, like, 10-15% more cranked into it. Like, it's got a bit more room to give. It feels the tiniest bit stiff in a way, as opposed to Ganondorf I actually like. It does still look, you know, strong and confident without looking like he's holding back nearly as much as Ganondorf does, but I would like the dial cranked up just a hair more, personally. With all of Incineroar's smash attacks, he also has very distinctive whiff and hit animations. If he whiffs here, I love this one at the end. He's like, oh, gosh darn it. And then if he connects, he does his obligatory celebration. Yeah, that one works really well because your eye's already sort of moving upwards. It's fun to land, too. The sound effect certainly fits, too, although a lot of Incineroar's moves use thuddier sounds. And I feel like that would fit this double fist or double forearm strike a little better. I think in general, Smash Ultimate does tend to assign a lot of the thuddy sounds to foot attacks, as opposed to punches and slaps and things like that, which tend to be a little higher pitched. And that's fine, but this one I just viscerally imagine feeling pretty thuggy to get hit by. So the attack animation itself is more of an A tier for me, but it's somewhat close, and when I consider how fun the separate on-whiff and on-hit animations are, I think that does bump it up to S. They put a lot of work into this, and it pays off. Clouds is, funny enough, kind of in the same ballpark, with a giant sword to help him out, of course. This one suffers a little bit from the same problem of the sword looking slightly too in control for me, but it's not that bad. This is also another one where I wouldn't necessarily despise seeing the chamber animation boosted up another 5-10%, that kind of level, but it's really not too bad even from a base level, and if you let it charge up all the way, he does eventually end up getting really into it. Even the follow through, yeah, the sword does stop slightly abruptly for my taste, but it's done for the sake of having him end up in a very strong, well-defined, good-looking pose. I like that. So I'd largely give it a pass, and he also does a pretty nice, slick little flip around with the Buster Sword to get it back into idle afterwards. The thicker particle effects once again work quite well for me here. I guess if you squint a little, you can say there's some slight hint of tip emphasis, but not really. But the length of the sword and his limbs and the speed of the attack, we're sort of back in Ganondorf territory where it just comes across as a solid block of damage. We again have a somewhat more high-pitched sound. And I've said this in other episodes, it's cool you get something unique. It's not really my all-time favorite sound design in the game. It just sounds a little bit light and airy compared to such a massive chunk of metal hitting you. The heavy variant's not terrible, though. It does have some chunkiness behind it compared to the light one. That's the one that tends to get to me a little bit more, especially when it's used inappropriately. So I'll take it. I think I'm willing to go A tier here. Again, I would like it exaggerated slightly more, but you can definitely make a case for not doing that. It's pretty well done technically across the board, and it does feel, for what's essentially a fairly straightforward sword animation, at least a little bit unique. Sephiroth. This is, again, at the end of the day, a relatively straightforward upward sword arc, but it's just allowed to have so much more flair and personality behind it. That's not really anyone's fault, you know. Cloud's whole thing is kind of being the stoic, classic JRPG hero type where Sephiroth gets to be the villain who often are allowed to have a lot more fun, and you do really feel it in this one. There is some clipping in this one, unfortunately, and clipping happens in video games. It happens a lot. It happens a lot in Smash animations. I really don't tend to begrudge it against moves at all, really, but for this one, it takes place at the beginning of the animation in a part that's extremely obvious and easy to avoid, and they just kind of didn't bother. I understand you have to cheat a little bit with some Sephiroth stuff to even get that sword to cooperate in the first place. It is ridiculously over the top, but yeah, I wish they could have gotten around it. It's not horrible that they don't, but it does not impress me. The rest of the swing is nice. He comes up and around here, definitely shows up more on this side as opposed to this where his back is facing you the entire time. You can't even really tell that his leg is in the air. The coat does get in the way there, but it's very smooth spin into the attack, and as he comes down, he does another smooth spin back into idle. I like the way he flips the sword around in his hand again, like Cloud does. The sword blade does, again, stop somewhat abruptly, but I'm much more accepting of it here just because the blade is so thin, so it just inherently looks easier to control. The entire move has kind of an elegance to it that Cloud's very intentionally lacks in comparison, and you get that in the sound design too, where it sounds kind of whippy. Even if you get the sour spot, which admittedly is not the absolute most intuitive system in the world. I think this is one of the moves where its sweet spot is on the middle of the blade. I think the particle effects in their defense are trying to convey that. There's a tipper section, but it's not nearly as prominent as certainly someone like Marth, and then there's a much thicker portion near the middle of the blade, and by the time you're getting close to the hilt, it starts fading out. So they are trying. I still feel like they could be leaning into that a bit more, but to some extent, it's not even really the animator's fault. This is just kind of an unintuitive system for a sword character in general, especially when you factor in that some of his moves do have the sweet spot on the tip. You know what? I've kind of talked myself out of that. I think if you're going to have a character who has two different sweet spot systems, depending on whether he's stabbing or swinging, the swing should probably have an extremely exaggerated middle of the blade effect, which they didn't really commit to here. I came in thinking I was going A tier on that one, but honestly, it's a B. There are just a few too many technical issues. The pit's more upward sword arcs. In theory, you could say these are kind of a Link rip off a triple upward sword arc, but they feel so different between the speed differential and obviously having two swords that I don't really find myself making that comparison in my head. They don't feel all that strong compared to Link, and they're not, which is fair, but at the same time, man, this startup is really nothing. Look at this. Even if you fully wind the chamber animation up, he's barely prepping for the attack at all, and He doesn't really spring off the ground all that convincingly. He ends up in a pretty defined pose at the end, but it does have the Mii Sword Fighter problem where he's doing it in the air so he feels less rooted to the attack. I wonder if honestly Mii Sword Fighter took some inspiration from him alongside Link. And there is technically some tipper emphasis on them, but not really enough. Even with the blistering speed, I don't think these feel particularly whippy. The swords are just too short in the first place, so having more tipper emphasis would certainly help convey a bit more of that sense of extreme speed, because on this attack, with how fast the swords are moving and how thick the particle effects are, it just kind of feels like a blur, which is not the worst thing in the world to do, especially for a character with dual swords, but it's also so hard to track that it doesn't really feel particularly dangerous. You know, your eyes need to be able to tell the blades are actually cutting. This just kind of looks like a whirlwind of movement. Also, I'm just saying, these guys have two swords, so to borrow a term from card games, it's a bit of a flavor fail. Like if you were to convert Pit into a Magic card or a Pokemon card or a Yu-Gi-Oh card, he'd probably have some kind of attack that lets him hit twice, right? A lot of his other moves have that kind of emphasis, or just lean into the bow mode's full-on frenzy of attacks, and that's also fine as far as I'm concerned. But the most distinctive thing about these characters are their weapon, right? They dual wield, which almost no Smash characters do, and they can convert that into a bow staff, and again, no other characters have that, and they already don't lean into that nearly as much as I would like. Here, I've put the bow back together. Here, I've separated it, and functionally that does nothing. But yeah, this is one of the attacks that most rubs it in your face that they don't really care about embracing that unique identity, which is a bit of a shame. It honestly feels kind of lame to land too. It's not actually a terribly weak attack, but it looks and sounds like it is. They do have the same element as Mii Sword Fighter where there's a bit of extended hang time, and that is kind of fun to use, but even that is not emphasized nearly as much, because while they technically do come off the ground right away, they're barely off the ground up until the last hit. So yeah, I main Dark Pit. I didn't necessarily come in expecting to be so harsh to these, but if I give them a closer look, they're C tier, and based on my own criteria, I think you could make an argument for F. Let's do Bowser. This is a fun concept, right? This big shell bash thing. It's fully invincible on the shell while he's doing it, and that does make a fair amount of intuitive sense. A lot of anti-airs in Smash are at least a little invincible, and this one gets some bonus points for being attached to the giant armored shell of a super heavyweight. But it's such a big part of the move's identity that I do wish there was some kind of visual indication of that. I'd appreciate a little bit of metallic sheen or whatever. It's a very nice low chamber pose that he goes into here that gives him plenty of space to spring up. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of converting some of that momentum into that spin, though. Yeah, sure, spinning around in his shell is something Bowser's always done in Smash, and Mario for that matter, but I've always thought this move here doesn't feel nearly as powerful as it could. It feels good, but it could feel better, and I'm pretty sure some of that does have to do with taking energy away from the spring up, which is what's actually causing the damage, and having to convert that into rotational momentum, because this isn't like a move where he traps you on the shell in a multi-hit or anything. As opposed to, again, up special where spinning makes a lot more sense. It's a single hit, so I do think that having all of Bowser's kinetic energy converted into that, along with having a steadier silhouette, maybe with the shell expanding in size more, that would help sell this entire thing better. So would the sound design, by the way. It doesn't sound bad if you hit them with the shell. I like the sort of rumbling effect, but this is one that I really feel like it could have gotten that big reverb hit. This does have a secondary earthquake hitbox on it too, not that you would really tell, it barely ever comes up, and the animation really doesn't play into it. In fact, I think putting a big earthquake particle effect on this when that's not actually part of the move would be somewhat irresponsible. At the end of the day, I'm feeling another B tier on this. It's fun. It could be a lot more fun though. Meta Knight. Okay, so we're back to another triple upward slash, like with Link, like with the Pit. This one has a bit of its own style to it. It's another extremely aerial focused one, more aerial I would say than the Pits get, which makes sense given Meta Knight's status as, you know, an extremely air-centric character all across the Kirby games and certainly the Smash titles too. They're really trying to make something happen with this tiny body and this tiny sword. It's not really coming across that strong though. In fact, this chamber animation just kinda sucks. He could be flattening down a lot more. I know getting super flat's more of Kirby's thing, but they're technically the same species. Once he lets it go, there's way more emphasis there, and I do like the final little posy strikes. This looks nice and strong, even if from the other side it just kind of looks like he's mooning you, but even from the good side, it's not like it gets a ton of emphasis. The particle effects are putting in at least a bit of work for some of the attack, but the thing is, because all three of these hits are made so uniform that they essentially just form one solid crescent, it becomes extremely hard to track what each individual part of the sword is doing, which means none of them feel particularly weighty or sharp, and therefore not particularly dangerous. attacks. Flurry attacks certainly can feel very powerful, but I think you're inherently setting yourself up for a bit more of a challenge with that type of move, and in particular, you really need to sell it with that final strike, and this one's just not doing it for me. This is a fairly weak up smash, and it feels like it. Actually a little bit weaker than the pits, but if anything, I would say it feels slightly stronger just because his body gets to move around more and he lands a bit more heavily, and the final hit's a little more emphasized, and the sound design's not quite so anemic, and he only uses a single sword, and really fast blade slash flurries are a huge part of his identity as a character, so there's not really the same kind of reason to be upset about him not doing specifically a double slash. I guess that lets him sneak into B tier. It's pretty unremarkable, but it's not bad, I guess. Let's finish up the Kirby gang. We're back to another single overhead sword swing, or overhead hammer swing in this case. It's not bad, it doesn't feel nearly as hefty as I want it to though. This one is very much fighting the gravity problem, especially because the first part of the attack hits when he's just starting to bring it off the ground and it will be at its weakest. I feel like with the chamber pose he goes into though, you could save this to some extent by having it drag along the ground during that initial swing, and then as it pops off the ground, it immediately speeds way up. Maybe even have the shaft of the hammer bend a little bit as he does it, because that would really let it just spring off like a rocket, right? Which this move, I feel like it kind of needs. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to see the shaft bending so much from this side, but the core principle would still apply and you'd still know what was going on. Have some dirt particle effects and maybe some sparks fly off during that initial scraping, because as is, this just doesn't really feel like it gets going in the way I want it to. Yes, it is a large weapon that he's swinging, so even if it is uniform, even if it doesn't feel like it's got explosive movement behind it, sure, it'll still hit hard, but this is a super heavyweight character swinging one of the single largest weapons in the entire franchise, so I don't want, sure, it hits hard, you know, I want an absolute titanic wrecking ball to be coming through. It feels fine, including landing the back part. Thankfully, they're both very strong. The back portion here, if anything, should have more momentum behind it because it's going with gravity instead of against it. But I don't get why they have this really fun, distinctive hammer sound that he uses for his forward smash. And then his other smash attacks don't get it. B tier. King DDD has some attacks that feel really fun and exciting to land. This is not one of them. Greninja. Okay, we're back to double overhead sword territory, or overhead kunai territory in this case. Why is it the character who has to spawn them in makes use of the concept way better than the characters who always have them? Especially if you get it in the air as intended. Assuming it actually works. This is a move that infamously fails a lot. Now, admittedly, this isn't an attack that necessarily needed two kunai for anything besides that final double-sided coverage at the end, but still, it's two weapons doing what's ultimately a two-parted multi-hit. I do wish he committed to it a bit more, though. That pose he goes into is not particularly low, and then the spring up is okay. The spring down lacks some weight as well. This is a frog. You're telling me he can't get into a better bouncing stance than that? I do love how he puts it away at the end here, though. Yeah, that feels ninja-y. It's another B tier. DK. Yes, the big clap. Good force behind this one. There's some fun elasticity in DK's arms. I keep using the term whippy in this video. His arms actually look pretty whippy, and they're doing some great body breaking on those hands as well, which you very much notice if this connects. I do think it would be more fun if it had a bit more of a defined hand clap sound though. And the other thing I guess is, if you whiff it, it does, I suppose, still look like he's doing, you know, a proper clapping motion. You can make it out, but you could also be forgiven if you thought this was, say, just a double-fisted pincer-style punch. There's not really that much emphasis on the actual clapping motion unless you make contact, in which case it becomes obvious. Now, coming down into that strongman pose afterwards, strong ape pose, you know, it is fun. But yeah, left to his own devices, his hands are actually only together for a couple of frames here. I feel like that could be held just a hair longer. Just enough so that you more consciously pick up on this silhouette. I'm still feeling an A tier though. Diddy Kong. Now, for Donkey Kong, while I do wish they gave his moves concept a little bit more clarity, it's at least a very strong, defined concept. For Diddy Kong, I don't even know what this is supposed to be. If we slow it way down, we can see he does a slap into a kick into a punch. I couldn't have told you that. In practice, this just kind of looks like mush. The slap and the kick are following a very similar arc with the particle effects, which, similar to some other flurry overhead stuff we've looked at, is designed to give the move a sense of cohesion, and I can appreciate that, but at the same time, it makes it even harder to tell what Diddy is actually doing. Like, okay, if we go into the chamber animation, you can at least tell he's probably going to be doing a slap there, and it's not a terrible setup for it. If you just let it rip though, yeah, it's mush. Even with the benefit of hit lag slowing it down, I still can't tell what the hell's going on. And I don't find it very fun to land, and I'm not sure what it has to do with the rest of his kit. I guess there's a vague martial arts theme going on. This barely even feels like it plays into it though. Yeah, it's an F tier. I've always hated this move, although I've never looked at Y before. And the Croc. This is obviously an extremely strange up smash, and they're also obviously going for funny, and yes, I'll give it up, this is funny. Now the thing is, I'm almost tempted to call it too funny, because King K. Rool's kit overall, you know, it obviously doesn't take itself too seriously, but for the most part, it's not this just straight up goofy. So this one move here kind of does come out of left field for me. That said, it makes me feel something, which is a big part of making me like an animation, so I'll give it that. The way it works is also a little unintuitive. You've got this falling portion, okay, makes sense. You've got this rising portion, again, makes sense. This initial upwards portion still is the strongest part of the move, but it doesn't really feel like it, honestly. It's pretty, like, skinny and quick, and he doesn't really exert himself that much. It feels like the part of the move they actually want you to hit is the downwards portion here, because the physics behind that, as he just cartoonishly goes into almost a Family Guy flop, it's really satisfying. And obviously I'm exaggerating a little, but he gets some hang time and then just plummets down very unnaturally fast. And it gets the Quake here, so that obviously feels strong, and he doesn't even really linger on the upwards hitbox at all. Yeah, it feels like they actually want you to do this. But, oh, wait, that actually sucks. Why did you put so much effort into the secondary portion of the animation? And then the part that actually kills people, it feels like an afterthought. At least it's got a funny boing. I can appreciate the boing. So yeah, I know a lot of people are going to want S tier for this one. I can't do it. Now, I will say props to the animator for taking the secondary part of the move and putting so much work into making it feel good, but A, I wish the actual dangerous part got the same kind of love, and B, this just kind of feels like a bit of a messy move where what the attack is doing and what the animation is doing aren't always married together that well. Which I don't love to say, because style-wise, this really is one of the most memorable up smashes on the roster. And speaking of memorable up smashes, yes, Snake's infamous mortar launcher, probably the single most unique up smash in the entire game. Charging it up does not actually make the move stronger, but it does start sending it higher and higher up. The animators got a bit of a break on the charging animation on this one. They didn't have to do a whole lot of anything, as a matter of fact. I do like the initial startup animation though. I've never noticed that a plate appears for the mortar, and there's a pretty convincing slam into the ground. It does have a bit of the shulk problem though, where it doesn't quite convince me they should actually be getting launched by this, and again, it's not too far off. They really just needed to add a little more quake or a bit of a particle effect and it would have been totally fine. I don't find myself minding it nearly as much with Snake as I do with Shulk though, maybe because it's just a heftier looking thing coming out, and it's something Snake doesn't usually carry around, which makes it a little more of a distinct I'm doing an attack right now kind of motion. Still bugs me a bit, but I don't find myself questioning it anywhere near as much. The sound design here is pretty much entirely carried by Snake's grunt, which is actually a bit of a letdown because mortars can sound extremely satisfying. And frankly, while I like the willingness to experiment, it is a bit of a weird thing to give Snake that I really doubt he'd have if he was made as a new Smash character for Ultimate, but based on sheer uniqueness and memorability alone, I think that's going to go into A tier. What about Villager? This one is kind of the family-friendly take on the idea. Now, I do like the concept, it's fun, but these attacks that try and tell, you know, a bit of a story every time they come out, they can often feel a little bit rushed and a little bit forced to me, and I think that applies here. I understand the entire concept behind Villager is, you know, let's just chuck a bunch of Animal Crossing stuff together and pray it results in a coherent moveset, and for the most part, I would say it turned out surprisingly well, honestly, but this is one of the attacks that comes off, at least to me, as feeling a little shoehorned in, especially because for a concept that, if nothing else, is certainly fun, it doesn't actually necessarily feel that great to use. Villager's got some decent animation, but of course he can't actually contribute to the power of the move in any way. That's entirely down to the fireworks launcher, so I don't know why it's totally static. Why is that one not squashing down to build up and then stretching up to help with the launch? And then for the actual fireworks themselves, they look pretty, it's a nice little bit of particle work, but why is there not one big final firework that actually sends the opponent flying? Because as is, we're back in Roy and Crom's up smash territory where it feels like the move just sort of ends. And there is a very discernible firework sound effect here. But in the same vein as Snake, this is potentially an extremely fun sound effect that's weirdly muted here. In fact, the whistle, that very distinctive fireworks noise, is almost entirely drowned out if you actually hit someone. I will say, nice job giving it a fuse sound effect as you charge up. I don't know why it cuts out partway through though. Now, Smash Ultimate does have this second charging portion where your animation stops running, which previous Smash games have not had. You just had to let it rip at that point. So if I had to guess, this is probably just recycling the Smash 4 sound effect, which would obviously chop off at that point. That's just a guess, though. It's not a huge deal, but yeah, they probably should have fixed that. This is a C tier. It'd probably get B if there was even like a little bit of basic squash and stretch on the tube. That one just comes across as lazy. Isabelle, of course. No fireworks display this time around. We instead have the stop sign popping out of the ground, or stop-ish sign popping out of the ground. Apparently this is actually supposed to be a do not enter sign, which kind of makes sense as an anti-air. I do still feel like it would make a bit more sense in other contexts, like this would be a fantastic counter animation, the most direct just no of any counter in the entire game, but it still fits better for me than Villagers does. Again though, I do wish the animation on the actual sign itself was a bit stronger. It's more important in this case because there's no secondary projectile. That is the attack. It's not the worst. The timing for the keyframing on the scale up is fine, and there's even a bit of a settling animation at the top. That's a nice bit of attention to detail. But again, even just a very basic bit of squash and stretch could have gone a long way here. I do like Isabelle's animation here though. It's crisp, and while she's not physically contributing to the actual attacking portion, it's snappy, which does contribute to the overall feel of the silhouette. And she's got some more agency here as well, so it feels more natural as an attack, even though you may be wondering why is there a sign popping out of the ground. In Smash, you know, I actually don't. Pretty nice sound design on this one as well. Listen for the whistle, obviously, but also the metal clanking and the little squeaky sound as it goes away. Is that the same as her hammer? Oh, no, but it could be. And if you hit someone, little bit of a disconnect with the material here. I think this should sound more like ringing metal and not like that thud. But it feels good. A tier. If this was a counter, I might be willing to give it as for sheer audacity. Palutena. Here we have another summoning a thing out of the ground style attack, although obviously the context is a bit different. By scale alone even. Kind of a lame chamber animation on this one. Palutena is supposed to have a very upright, regal feel through a lot of her attacks actually, but as you can see, once you let it go, she really doesn't have all that far to travel because she just wasn't leaned down that far to begin with. It's a conscious choice, to be clear. She's essentially always supposed to be upright while she's attacking. That's just part of her style. Part of an effort to make her look more divine, I guess. But she could give it just a little more. Now, I will say inside the distance she does get to travel, she's decently snappy with the attack, and that does help. She goes into her final pose quite quick, one foot comes off the ground a bit, all that's nice. I do wish there was a little bit more overextension with the staff arm that then settles back into position though. Yes, it does look snappy, but it could look a little snappier, and again, with these conjuring style moves, the character who's doing the conjuring can't physically contribute to the attack, but the more they look like they're trying to, the more viscerally we end up feeling the attack overall. Sounds appropriate if it whiffs. If you hit, sounds fine. It does sound a little more magical though, which again I think kind of takes the edge off a lot of the time. It would be cool if there was like a sizzling, vaporizing sound in there too. I'm feeling another A tier here. It does do a fair amount of stuff right, and the thing it does the most right is once again be very memorable. Pokemon Trainer. Starting off with Squirtle, we've got another of these conjuring style moves. This time around, double the value. Probably my favorite one I've seen here, honestly. He puts a lot of effort into that little pop-up. It almost reminds me a bit of a rain dance. I feel like they may be taking some inspiration from that, but he leans down very far, puts a lot of effort into that initial chamber animation, gives him plenty of room to pop up. He pops up very aggressively, and I like that pose he strikes. The water particle effects look good, but they don't completely obscure him. You can clearly see everything that's going on. I feel like they could maybe use a little bit more foam or spray to invoke a breaking wave a bit more, but really not bad, and I like the bubbling as he charges it up too. It sounds pretty weak, unfortunately. That's a bummer. Ivysaur's is another bulb charge. It's essentially a grounded version of his up air. I like that it rears up on its front legs, so it has some space to really push off on its back legs afterwards. It doesn't actually end up committing to the attack all that much in the moment, though. The bulb launch itself, by far the most important part, its back is barely arched. I prefer the sound effect to Squirtle, but I prefer it because it sounds generically okay. It really doesn't invoke much of what this actually is to me. It just kind of sounds like a generic, slightly thuddy explosion. And then Charizard, honestly, I've always hated this one. It looks very awkward to me. This is another one where the charge up is very subdued looking, not getting into it too much, and then the launch off. That's the wrong wing. Yeah, look at this. The wing on the left side of the screen is getting tucked in a punching-like motion. Look at its arms to confirm that. And then the leading wing is the one that actually throws it out. Why? There's no wind-up on that. It probably sounds the best of any of them. And I think this is the context where those more generic sound effects work best, but it feels awkward to look at, it feels awkward to use. Charizard uses its wings for a lot of upwards facing moves, which is a fine design concept, but if it's implemented this poorly, maybe they should reconsider F tier. Squirtle's gonna get A tier, and honestly, if it didn't sound so pathetically weak, it would be an S tier candidate. And Ivysaur, I'm feeling a C tier. You know, it's not really all that interesting a concept, it's recycled, and the implementation's not fantastic, the sound design's not fantastic. Zelda. This is kind of an unusual looking up smash. It's very intentionally weak looking, and I've been pretty critical of that throughout this video, whether we're talking about through the different motions of the character's arms, or we're talking about other magic users. I would still like more force shown, but I don't mind it for her specifically. It's in line with her characterization as the Legend of Zelda series Triforce of Wisdom holder, and they lean into that concept enough where I think if you made it look stronger, it would actually take away from the fundamental appeal of the animation. She doesn't do that everywhere on her kit, of course, but she does have some other moves that play into that as well. And yeah, as long as that's very clearly the animator's intentions, you can suspend your disbelief and sort of buy into the world of this character's powers. If you hit with it, it still unfortunately sounds too weak for my taste. That sparkly magical layer, yeah, I totally get why it's there, but the magic is devastating her opponent, right? There should be some kind of more dangerous sound laid underneath as far as I'm concerned. Some kind of hiss or sizzle or something I think would work well. And we're also suffering from the same problem of them looking like they're just kind of randomly launched out of it at the end. This silhouette I think works really well if she whiffs. If she lands it though, it does kind of become soup, and again, there's that random launch problem. So I think what I would really love to see with this one is if it was a dynamic animation, so it looks exactly the same here, but then if she makes contact, it ends with her raising her arm up. Now, that's too much work. I understand they really don't want to get down into the mud with this kind of stuff with a lot of these animations, but similar to Piranha Plant, this is another one where I think if they had the time to implement it, it could make a huge difference with probably not that much extra time investment realistically, but if you're frantically scrambling to make an 80+ character game, I get dropping it. So I think that's an A tier for me. Chic. See, what I really appreciate about this one is the visual clarity on where the sweet spot is. There's one really dangerous area right above her hands, and you can 100% tell just by looking at it. Now, why that should be the strongest point is actually a little unclear in the animation concept. It's right as her hands start to move down, so she hasn't actually built that much momentum up yet. Her charging animation doesn't really help with that, not in the sense that she's not putting effort into it. She really is. She lifts herself up on her toes and she really arches her back, so that throwing her hands down motion looks very strong, and her hands look very painful at the end after they've had time to build force up, but then that's the sour spot of the move, as opposed to... Also, I'm just saying, for a move called the Diamond Cutter that places so much emphasis on that one little point, the sound design is kind of bland on it. How nice would it be if there was some kind of shining, glinting, critical hit style sound effect there? That would tie the animation together so much. And again, while you could make the argument that the sweet spot is where her hands are crossing over so you get hit by both of them, getting brushed by fingertips still doesn't really sell that to me. I'm not totally buying it, but she really commits to the concept, even if it is a bit nonsensical, so that'll be an A tier. Wii Fit Trainer. Now, this is almost the inverse of Sheik's. The sweet spot is at the same point, but this time the arms start down and then go up. I'm on record as not particularly loving the yoga pose gimmick that her moves all use and thinking that a lot of the time it hurts more than it helps. This is one of the concepts where it fits better for me though. The chamber pose starts her off going very low. That foot does look a little funny though. And then at the end, she really springs up into it. That's a very strong, decisive line of action that goes straight up. Or I should say, she springs into it as much as a character can who doesn't use any kind of body breaking. There's no squashing or stretching or compressing of any kind on here, so she can't overshoot and then come back a bit as she springs up. I feel like that would help a lot, and the same with no motion smears or any other kind of particle effect. That's an aesthetic decision they've made specifically for Wii Fit Trainer. I feel like that really gets in her way. I bring that up in a lot of episodes, and it is a big hindrance here. I do appreciate that she actually holds the yoga pose for a decent amount of time so you can tell exactly what's going on though. She doesn't have the Donkey Kong problem. And it feels pretty good. It's fun they really mix the voice lines up.
You're wobbling. Try to keep your balance.
The male version.
Exercise every day to help tone your body.
Wii Fit Trainer's historically been one of the lowest rated characters in these videos. This time around I'm going A tier for her though, and if she employed some nice body breaking and maybe some smear particle effects to really sell the power of the move, this might be S tier. I understand for her specifically, they intentionally didn't do that, I guess, to preserve the purity of the yoga poses, but it's my list and I don't like it at all. I think it looks awful way more than it works. In this case, I obviously don't think it looks awful not to include them, but it would look better if you did. What about Bayonetta? Another Conjuring style move, obviously. This one has a lot of style behind it. She summons Madame Butterfly's limbs from a portal using the same hair that her suit's made out of, and I do kind of wish the portal was on the ground before the limb came out, just because from a visual clarity perspective, it would be nice as a danger marker for her opponents. But at the same time, right as she starts the move up, an arcane circle appears and then quickly fades out, and that's also a danger indicator that I like having around, and I can understand maybe both of them being on screen at the same time is distracting. The limb comes out decently fast. I wish it was a bit more explosive looking, but of course, because it's so big, having it move a bit slower does make inherent sense, and it's so big that it's hard not to feel forceful anyways. There is also a bit of squash and stretch on it, which I appreciate, and you can't really exaggerate it too much with something that huge, or else it starts getting very actively distracting. The whole point of those techniques is that they're supposed to be felt more than seen, and of course, the more screen space something takes up, the more likely you are to consciously notice it. I like the fist, and I like the loose hair implementation as it spirals back down into the portal. Now, switching between them is not handled very gracefully whatsoever, it just kind of abruptly changes. Obviously, what should actually be happening is you have the loose fist that then gradually unfurls into loose hair, but that would be a lot of very complicated animation work for really not that much more payoff. They just kind of invoke that feeling here, and it's fine. Bayonetta, as you'd expect, also very firmly commits to this attack even if she's not physically doing it herself. There's some fun twirling at the end there, and some more twirling with the gun. I can't say I've ever actually noticed her hair before. This is a cool touch. She gets long, flowing hair herself all the way throughout the entire thing, and then it gradually fades away, but it looks so natural and smooth, and of course, you're more interested in the giant fist flying at you that I've never really paid attention. Like with basically all of Bayonetta's moves, you can hold this one out to fire. Not my favorite in quarter speed, it looks a little goofy. Actually, at full speed, you know what? Still looks funny, especially because her hair freezes in place. It probably shouldn't be doing that. This is just not my all-time favorite firing animation she has. Not like you're ever actually gonna do that anyways. You're here for this, and it feels good. These are also attacks that might benefit from the reverb hit though, or something that makes them sound a bit more mystical tacked underneath, because it's a very generic punch sound, and you know, it's a giant demon lady's fist coming out of the portal from hell. Maybe there could be a bit more going on. So there are some parts of this I think could be handled a little better, but it's got so much packed in, there's so much attention to detail, and a lot of it is really handled quite well, so I think I'm gonna give S tier up. Now, admittedly, it is definitely on thin ice with that held firing animation, and you can definitely argue I should be taking that into account more, but you know what, for that particular move, having it on there is just a formality. You're never actually gonna do it. So I think you can almost just consider the core animation, and likewise, if the firing animation was very good, it would provide a small bonus. Steve. It's funny, I remember giving Steve the win over on MockRock back when he was a brand new character, but I've soured on it so much over time. Steve is another character where you can't judge him by traditional animation standards. I'm fine with all that. What I'm not fine with is that essentially nothing about this really makes that much sense. Why is it that for the most part Steve places blocks that look appropriately Minecraft sized, but then for this one specifically he just completely breaks that scale? That's not how things work in Minecraft. Now, don't get me wrong, Smash characters absolutely can and should break their source material sometimes, but first off, Steve is a late stage DLC character, right? So he's a character that Sakurai really tried to stuff as much source material into as possible, and for him specifically, there is so much source material you can pull from that if you start twisting it around like that and make it feel like it's no longer faithful to the game it comes from, I am gonna ask, what do you gain by doing so? Because there are 1,000 things Steve could be doing instead of this, and I don't really know what he gains. We're back to doing the foot hitboxes out of nowhere thing. It's an extremely strong up smash, but it doesn't really feel like it. Now, it thankfully doesn't suffer from the opponent's randomly popping out problem because he breaks the block himself, so it's nice it has an endpoint, I guess, although this still doesn't really justify why it would be launching him. And I really hope it's not saying you're getting launched by the pickaxe swing. That's nothing. Nothing about this. The starting it with the ground near your feet, the breaking the block to send them flying, the trapping them in a magma block in the first place, the placing a block here in the first place, the big block, feels like something I actually think of Steve from Minecraft craft as doing. It's just a really baffling choice for a move, which I can't say for a lot of Steve's kit. Like, for many of his moves, even though personally I would have gone with something else, I can really follow the logic of what they're doing with them. I can't here. At least it is an up smash that has some character to it. You are more likely to remember it than a lot of these. Apart from that, and being a multi-hit that has a definitive finisher section on it, there's not a ton else I really like about it. Pyra and Mithra. Okay, so we're back into multi-hit territory. This one kind of has a definitive finisher on it. It still looks a little bit random, but you know, there's something, it at least marks her starting the twirl. That is specifically if you pick Mithra though. If you go to Pyra, she has the same animation like basically all their moves do, but this one is not the same kind of multi-hit. There's essentially just the scoop, and then they're immediately launched out while she's still twirling the sword around. This is a problem a lot of their moves have, where they have to share essentially all the same animations, but some clearly work much better on one character than the other. For most of the multi-hit stuff, it works better for Mithra. Nice far bend down into a very strong pop up, including one leg off the ground. I do like that. The way that she comes down at the end and smoothly catches the sword in one fluid motion works for me as well. I will say though, during that final wind down portion, her hair looks pretty gross. They don't have that flowing like it should. Now, Pyra does all the same stuff, of course, but with her much shorter hair, she simply does not have this problem. And also, while that final catch is smooth enough, I feel like there could be a bit more of a flourish at the end. She could catch it maybe more around here, and that would give her some time to do a proper swing with the sword around her body as she moves into that final crouching position before going back up into idle. Not really that noticeable at scale, though. It still does look fairly smooth. The Mithra hair thing, though, that actually is noticeable. It comes off as kind of choppy, and if they had that flow around her properly, it could look really nice. You know, follow a nice smooth arc and maybe flare out behind her at the end, almost like a cape. For Mithra, we're back to the laser sword problem where it sounds way more distinctive on whiff than it does on hit. I really like this sound effect. And then for Pyro, we're back to very generic sound effects on whiff. But if they hit, it's still generic sound effects, but it's that heavy flame sound that I really like. For Pyra, I'm gonna go B tier, and Mithra gets A. It feels way more appropriate on her. The hair thing is a wrinkle, but it's not that big a deal at the end of the day. Sure, let's just make this DLC bullshit time. Kazuya feels a little stiff and uncomfortable while he's doing this, and I'm never really sure how to handle that in these videos because that is the Tekken vibe. Yeah, though, there's really just no wind-up or snappiness or anticipation of any kind on this. He simply moves his arm through space. Now, all of his smash attacks are obligated to use the devil form. That's part of his design concept, and forward smash makes some decent use out of the wings. There's a, you know, nice little bit of flare out behind him there, a cool little silhouette. And honestly, it's the same for down smash. There's a nice little bit of follow through there. For up smash specifically, though, they really contribute nothing. If anything, they kind of get in the way. They don't actively hide the punch on this side, but at the same time, look at how it just awkwardly flops around his body. Yeah, it's not like the wings are necessarily doing a ton here, but they do actively help out. Imagine if here they were flapping either up to help him build some extra force behind his fist, or flapping down to anchor him to the floor more. Either of those would be great, but here, the way they come out of his body and sort of awkwardly freeze during the later portion of the windup feels rough. The way they retract at the end, that doesn't feel very nice either. There's not really any kind of circular follow-through on this. He simply goes out one way and comes back the other. And oh god, that torso. You don't really see it too much on this side, but over here, oh yeah. Once again, that is the Tekken classic. On hit, Tekken has lower hit lag than a lot of fighting games, and they faithfully carried that into Smash. As with the awkward feeling animations, there are pros and cons to that sometimes. On this move here, I think it is just a straight up weird feeling thing to do. I think because it essentially completely overrides the feeling of gravity doing anything to stop that upwards momentum. She just kind of explodes off his fist. Yeah, I'm not giving this one any canon faithfulness points. Everything it brings into Tekken makes it feel gross and weird, and that means it's going in F tier. Which is a shame, because if you follow competitive Smash, you sure see it a lot. Pikachu. This is another very simple up smash, and it makes sense. You know, Pikachu's been around since the original Smash and is arguably the single most iconic mascot character in the world. You really don't want to be overstuffing these kits too much. But, you know, maybe you could stuff in a little more spice here and there, because I just feel absolutely nothing. We're essentially back in bicycle kick territory again, except this time around with the tail just getting out in front of those feet to actually deal the damage, which, considering what those feet actually look like, that's probably a good call. But even though the tail portion is the part doing the attack, it barely feels like it, because it's not very big and it's not really given any kind of growth boost, and it's almost entirely obscured by that particle effect, which almost feels like it's what's doing the damage instead, like Pikachu summons some ultra limp looking energy field. You know, if they just made it a bit more blatantly metallic looking, you could pretend this is Iron Tail. That would help. Maybe put some shimmer on the tail itself too, but oh no, that would feel too much like the Pokemon games. We can't have that on our Smash 64 character. It feels terrible to hit with, and I hate the tail sound effect in this game. It feels so limp and weak, even though this is actually a decently strong up smash. I remember Captain L, one of the best Pikachu players in Smash 4, directly citing that new tail sound effect as one of the reasons he didn't want to keep playing Pikachu. It's that off-putting, and I don't blame him, that's the thing. It doesn't help that the tail stays completely stiff the entire way through, so there's none of that sense of whippiness. It's an F tier. I honestly have trouble naming something it does right. Mewtwo. Yeah, this is a fun concept, looking like you're essentially spawning an entire galaxy out of your hand, appropriate for a Pokemon as powerful as him. Mewtwo's another character that stays somewhat upright for the most part, not nearly as emphasized as Palutena though, and you can tell he is bending into the animation more, and that's a pretty good pop-up too. A little bit of an overshoot on the arm, I appreciate that, the way it comes down in that final definitive, almost Dragon Ball-ish pose. The sound design is pretty generic, but it sounds good. We are also unfortunately back to a little bit of that randomly popping out problem. It's not the worst we've seen, but it's there. It would be nice if, again, there was more of a concrete finisher on this. I think I'm going A tier for this one. It's fun and pretty well done. Lucario. This is vaguely in the same ballpark, I guess. Lucario did take over from Mewtwo in Brawl, after all. I'd have a hard time telling you this is the single most, you know, memorable up smash animation on the roster, but it does invoke a little bit of that lonely warrior on a mountaintop kind of vibe, and Lucario absolutely does commit to it. Look at how low he goes on this. He turns into a straight up pancake, and then when he actually launches off, there's quite a lot of overshoot and squash and stretch on him. That's actually a common thing they do with Lucario. For whatever reason, his bones are treated as a little bit more rubbery than a lot of Smash characters get. Another character who's not ambidextrous but kind of feels like he should be. I'm not sure what's up with that. He obviously does have some martial arts inspiration behind his moveset, so maybe they're trying to maintain a proper stance for him at all times where your leading hand is your weaker hand. That would make sense. Like with all of his animations, apart from special moves, there's no difference between zero aura and full aura. That's a bit of a shame, but at least, you know what, throughout the entire thing, it does look very big and explosive. Although that does also have the side effect of making the hitbox a little hard to peg down. It's very nebulous because of all the energy going around everywhere. And it sounds weird, like clearly the big burst of blue energy is what's actually doing the damage, but then it's got a very physical hit punch kind of sound effect. I don't know, it's a little strange. That's gonna be a B tier, I prefer the OGs. Byleth. Okay, so we're back to another big overhead flurry. This time with a whip sword, that's interesting, we haven't seen that in the series yet. It's a little more powerful than it actually looks though, and I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that the whip sword itself is moving quite a bit, but Byleth's arm, if you look at it, it's really not doing that much. It is very committal if you bend down with it, but then once you're actually attacking, it's again one of these moves where it's a little hard to tell what's even going on. I wouldn't say it particularly has the random pop-out problem, but that's more just because it's moving so fast that it's kind of hard to tell what's supposed to be happening with Lucina. There is a little bit of a flourish downwards at the end, but that doesn't really do the same thing, right? It should be, if anything, a flip up as a much more definitive finisher. That would definitely make me like this more. This is feeling like a C tier for me. This is a move you see Byleth players break out not too infrequently, and I remember being surprised by that at first. And I do think some of that surprise just came from the fact that the animation doesn't make it look particularly impressive. Zero Suit Samus. Another overhead whip flurry, albeit with a very different feel behind it. This one does work better for me though, because even though it's not as strong feeling, A, it's not as strong, and B, it's got more of an actual concrete direction for what Zero Suit Samus is up to. You can tell what the intention behind the move is, compared to Byleth, who again just kind of felt like soup. Nice firm commitment here. She bends down very low, and then on the way up, that is a actually quite smooth pirouette she launches into. And because it's an electrical move, it's got extended hit lag on it, and those often feel quite nice to land. Nice layered sound design on it as well. You've got those really thuddy hits in combination with that fairly high-pitched, almost reeling kind of effect they gave her Plasma Whip. I again would maybe appreciate a little bit more of a sizzling or frying sound underneath as well, but overall, I still think it sounds quite nice. Very solid upper A tier. Peach and Daisy. Okay, so we've got this ribbon dance. Now, to my understanding, Peach isn't particularly associated with ribbons in any of her games, really, but she is very associated with hearts, and in Ultimate, they play into that aspect of her aesthetic a lot more, and I appreciate that. She bends down quite a bit. Obviously, you can't really tell what her knees are doing because they're covered by the dress, but you can still really clearly see that she is investing into the attack, and then on the way up, Once again, pretty smooth pirouette. Viewed up close, it does lose a little bit of punch because I think her arm is separated from the pivot point just a bit too much. This would look more like a proper spear hand strike and feel a little more like you're drilling into them if her hand more or less stayed entirely in place instead of twirling around like that. But at full gameplay scale and speed, you don't really care because the heart itself is the focal point. That's obviously what your eye is actually drawn to, and it does the exact same job. Sounds about how you'd expect on whiff. Kind of a heavier version of this thing. And on hit. Surprisingly heavy sound effect there. Does it happen if you hit with the weaker part? No. I've complained about a lot of magical attacks not feeling heavy enough when you hit them. This one has almost the opposite problem for me. It sounds very heavy. I wish it maintained a little more of that magic. And then for Daisy, it's nice that she uses the Daisy motif instead of the heart one. That's a common thing across her entire moveset. And maybe if you really want to stretch it, you can say this is reminiscent of the Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games titles where there are ribbon dance competitions. But who are we kidding? This is a Peachism, and I really doubt that if Daisy was brought in as even a slightly original take on an Echo Fighter, she would have it. So Peach is getting A tier because it's pretty well done technically, and it does suit her. Daisy is not a horrible fit, and the slight aesthetic change is nice, but she's still paying a bit of the clone tax. On the topic of which, despite Ryu and Kazuya, and Ken for that matter, coming from very different types of fighting games, they actually ended up with surprisingly similar up smashes. In Ryu's case, it is based off his crouching heavy punch from, I think, Street Fighter 3, which is maybe why he bends down so much at the start. You can see he puts a lot of weight on that rear leg, and then he can really drive off with it. It does go a little bit limp and look a little bit too controlled at the end, though. I understand these martial arts types are supposed to stay in control, but if this overshot a bit more and was a little bit more aggressive in the settling in animation, that would increase the sense of power that Ryu gets out of this, because it doesn't really feel that strong. Maybe because it's not that strong. And I can understand not making that the highlight of his kit. You know, in Street Fighter, it's supposed to be more for anti-airs than anything else, and he obviously has no problem with vertical finishers in general. But still, yeah, it could have been pushed further anyways. It is a smash attack in this game. I don't really care about the source material. It should hit hard here. And the unique Street Fighter sound effects, I generally really like them. Here, it's a lighter one, and that's not helping. Compare this to this. Right? And then Ken has a lot of cool clone differentiation from Ryu. Not so much this time, and that's fine. These are both getting B tier. I cut them a bit of slack for the source material. They're not outright offensive looking like Kazuya's is, but I do think that source material needed to be exaggerated a bit more to fit Smash better. And then in a bit of Shoto solidarity, Terry once again has basically the same thing. This is by far my favorite of any of them, though. That follow through he does with his fist up at the top, that is exactly the kind of thing that I wanted to see Ryu and Ken doing. Now, the way he catches himself to do the chamber animation is kind of wonky looking. He starts to accelerate forward, then moves back, but oh man, that is an aggressive chamber animation. And then when he lets go, he does that, and then even the pull back afterwards has so much more flair behind it. He's like, yeah, got him, even if he didn't actually got him. What else would you expect from Mr. Bogard? Other than that very minor hiccup going into the charge, this is essentially a flawless take on that move concept, and I appreciate that enough for S tier. Mega Man. There is some nice detail put into this. I love the discharge of smoke at the end. I really like the way his arms transform. This one here is a pretty smooth transition up as those, I guess, cuffs around his fists just gradually turn into the needles. Only a couple of frames, but you do notice it in real time. So yeah, some nice attention to detail on quite a bit of this stuff. I just wish it actually felt like a proper smash attack. His movements are so muted, which is a common trait among a lot of Mega Man stuff. I think they're supposed to emulate the feel of those NES sprites, which obviously don't have a huge range of motion. But I have to say this essentially every episode, Mega Man is basically the only retro character that gets that kind of treatment, and I don't like it. It always just feels off-putting to me because he's obviously not a pixel-based character in Smash Ultimate. He's a full 3D model like the rest of them, but he's moving around as if he's not. It just feels weird. Now, this is not the worst example on his kit. Yes, the way he moves his arms up is not particularly committal and it looks fairly stiff, but he is touching electrical pins together to actually create the damaging area, so theoretically he doesn't need to put any force into it with his body whatsoever, although, as I've said throughout this video, it sure helps when you do. And as I said at the start of this section, that discharge portion is legitimately quite nice. Even the way he swings his arms down afterwards, I think makes the cooldown look more forceful than the actual sparks. There is technically a finisher hidden in these particle effects. If you look, there's a bit more of a yellow flash at the end, but I would still like more. And this is also a move where the very distinctive whiff sound effects get pretty heavily obscured if you connect it. I'll let it slip into B tier for the concept. Corrin. This is fairly reminiscent of Sheik's, at least as far as functionality goes, not so much concept maybe, and that's kind of an awkward feeling thing to give to a sword fighter. And it's also a very awkward feeling animation. These pins do grow, but why are they so long during the chamber animation? It means that there's just not that much space for them to actually move between. And Corrin crouches down very low, which you'd think would be doing a lot to contribute to the eventual boost up, but no. His body stays essentially completely still, and on this side it's just a lump where you can barely even see what's going on. I do appreciate the very strong visual clarity between the sour spot on the sides and then this very strong tipper. But as far as I'm concerned, it still feels terrible to use, and Fire Emblem Face also has some other animations that would work really well for an up smash. Yeah, that's an F tier. And our final Fire Emblem character, and also the most complicated Fire Emblem character, the Bronze Sword upward stab is very similar to other ones we've seen, although I really do like that flourish at the end. We're back to no foot hitbox territory, so you do need to be pretty precise with it. And this chamber animation, I'm sorry, it kind of sucks. It looks very awkward, and holding the sword at 90 degrees like that makes it really weird to try and line up the actual stab, but once the stab comes out, it's very committal. He gets up on his toes, and then he holds that strong pose for a decent amount of time. Once it's launched, it's pretty nice. That said, the real fun, of course, is the Levin Sword. And it's cool that for the physical magical weapon, like how it functions in Fire Emblem, they gave it a bit more of a magical feeling here as well. They didn't need to do that, but I can appreciate their desire to make it look more unique, even if it doesn't necessarily make it look stronger. And in fact, I've actually advocated for them not doing it before. I still kind of get the vibe that this pose here with some electricity crackling off the blade would have the most impact of any of them. But this is what we're dealing with, and by no means is it a bad thing to have on a move. Landing the weak hit, meh, as intended. Landing the strong hit, feels better for sure. Honestly, still feels a bit underwhelming for a Levin Sword attack. Some of them feel really nice. There are a fair amount of nitpicks, so I'm more feeling a B on this one. I could see some people advocating for A because of the flourish, though. Ice Climbers. It's just a fairly basic overhead sword arc, overhead hammer arc, not even the first of those we've seen today. It's pretty well done, though. They don't lean down particularly far, but the hammer is really cranked back along with their body torquing a lot, which does still generate a decent sense of power, and then during the launch, they go completely off the ground and really slam that mallet head down. There's a lot of power in that. It starts off looking very grounded, and then that grounding generates enough force for them to be completely lifted off in a pretty convincing manner. It would definitely look stronger if they weren't holding so close to the head of the hammer here, but it's still a pretty snappy motion with what's obviously quite a big weapon, so it convincingly looks like it would hurt. It works well with one or two of them. I like the arc that the hammers trace. Very satisfying to land, especially if you hit both of them. You know what? S tier, sure. Joker. We've got another upwards weapon swing. This is one of the more distinctive ones, I would say. Another one that goes off the ground, and another one where I would say I'm pretty convinced by the launch. It helps that he goes very far down in the first place here, and that kickoff also works. The landing pose does get a little muddy on this side, unfortunately. On this side, though, it's actually very strong. I like that a lot. And then, of course, Arsene comes out to play. What does he do alongside it? It looks like he's reaching down for some kind of uppercut, maybe? Okay, it's like a knife hand? No, more like a claw swipe almost. This is one that's very intentionally designed to be obscured by what Joker is doing, and it mainly just contributes to the particle effect. Not all of Joker's Arsene boosted attacks are like that. This one really leans into it, though. Same deal on this side, I'm assuming. Yeah, you don't really get to see what Arsene is up to until the particle effects are gone, and therefore the attacking portion is gone. Interesting that he's almost doing the same stance here, though. Again, that's not something they always do. Even then, it's clearly not just a keyframe copy and paste. Feels good, if a little bit light to hit with normally. That's obviously done to contrast with Arsene, which of course feels fantastic. Most of Joker's Arsene boosted moves do. And honestly, a slightly lighter sounding move is appropriate for a knife attack. And it's not like it really sounds that weak. Arsene is admittedly a bit underwhelming in this one, but it still gets the job done, and the base form is such a nice take on that upward sword slash concept that we've seen so many times. I think this is the first back-to-back S tier of the video. Bancho and Kazooie are down there all by themselves. We're back into upwards flurry territory. This one is decidedly more focused than a lot of them, though. The drill-like motion helps, and then there's a definitive finisher on it, which I've been talking up this entire video. Very dramatic wind-up on this one, as you'd expect from Banjo-Kazooie. A lot of their stuff is super exaggerated and cartoonish. That's part of why I tend to like them so much. And then the spin's a little hard to analyze at quarter speed, obviously, but I like that firm ending pose. Again, I really love that there's an actual concrete beak strike to send them flying. Yeah, at full speed and scale, the spin itself actually looks great, and I love that there are feathers that are flying out and then being caught up in the tornado. Here they are, actually quite logical behavior for a very cartoony animation, just obviously over the top. That's exactly what you want to see. But on hit, I wish it just sounded a bit more like an actual drill instead of leaning back to super generic stuff again. On whiff, you even get that metal clanking at the end. And even if it does have a finisher, if we're being honest, it tends to get lost in the actual fray. Making that more exaggerated and adding maybe a puff of feathers or something would definitely help. I thought we might be headed for a hat trick here, but unfortunately those details do subtract too much from the core visceral feel of actually using the move, so that is going to drop it to A. Pac-Man. All of Pac-Man's smash attacks employ the ghosts, so up smash is obviously no different. Not the most committal of any of these. He does bend down, but it's not that far. He does pop up on one leg, but it's not that forcefully, and it looks a little bit slidey and artificial. No substantial squash or stretch, and his arm doesn't really follow the line of action. It comes up in a circle, and then the ghost pops up, and that's a problem because if he was doing this kind of thing, the arm and the ghost would look like they were working in unison. As is, it looks like he's just kind of lazily plopping it up there and expecting it to do everything. The ghost does have some upwards movement, just a hair for follow through. I appreciate that, but it's not really selling it for me. Fun sound effects. And you do still hear the retro treatment even through the hit impact. I like that. And employing the ghost for the smash attacks is a fun concept, even if personally I would have rather seen them show up for a special move somewhere. I just feel like you could make better use of their unique characteristics, and also it feels a bit clunky having up and sideways, and then sideways again, but also on the other side. It just doesn't really scratch that cardinal direction itch properly. But altogether, I guess I can get it into B tier. If I was evaluating it purely on technical execution, it would slip more into C. Rosalina. There's another modal one, obviously, where we have Rosalina herself and Luma joining in. I've always kind of liked this up smash. I've got plenty of reasons not to. It's a very strange concept for one. Her arms don't actually do anything to contribute until the attack is over. Like, it's just energy appearing in front of her body that actually does it, and then her arms trail along after the fact. Is it supposed to be her crown that's doing the attack? I don't even think it is. I'm not sure what this is, even up close. Her chamber pose really looks like she's going into some kind of arm thing, and here you could still buy from her body language that that might be the case, except the particle effect has already appeared and is quite a long way through its arc. Is it supposed to be a head attack? I really don't know, but she is definitely committing to it. Whatever it is, she ends up going all the way back there. And while yes, it does look much wonkier if you view it under a microscope, at full speed and scale, it still looks a little funny, and I'm not 100% sure what she's doing. She almost seems like a marionette being jerked around, but I don't find myself questioning it anywhere near as much. It feels like a firm committal attack to me, and one that feels pretty good to use as well. And then, of course, you also have Luma's portion to consider, which, as it turns out, is a full-on bicycle kick, which I've never actually noticed before. But honestly, that's more on me, because if you look at it, even at full scale and speed, yeah, it's pretty clear that's what it's doing. Actually, impressively clear considering what a stubby body it has. Their silhouettes line up fairly well, too, if you do it at close range like this. Luma almost looks like it's riding Rosalina's wave a little. It does feel better to land with both of them, but it doesn't really fundamentally change that much. And Luma by itself, I'm not really sure what to do with her. It's a very strange up smash, and Rosalina, you know, she is a floatier character than average, and her animations do certainly lean into that, but she's not a character that you necessarily measure on an entirely different axis. You know, she's no Steve, she's no Mr. Game & Watch, she is still a conventional humanoid design. Luma doesn't really make her deviate from that too much. What I guess I can say is I really like Luma's contribution, and Rosalina's portion, it's a very strange animation that they could easily have just botched, but it does work for me. They pulled it off, so I guess for that boldness, I'll go A tier. I feel like you can make a reasonably solid case for literally all of these, though. Little Mac. If you're gonna make a boxer character, you know you've got to have a real big uppercut in there somewhere. And oh yeah, this is a real big uppercut that he's leaning into. And it also has a sweet spot right on the ground, and there's a pretty strong visual indicator. From a physics perspective, it's not really that sensible to have the most dangerous portion of the attack come out when its momentum is just starting to build up, compared to this. But if his whole thing's supposed to be total ground dominance, then, you know, it does kind of make sense. You're on my turf now, you're gonna suffer for it. I do definitely prefer it on this side, though. The profile's more satisfying, and you get to see that nice circular follow-through a lot better. I almost thought at the end here that he might be lacing his gloves back up with his teeth. I don't think that's actually what the idea behind it is, but it looks very decisive in any case. And it is still a very grounded looking move, like of course basically everything on his kit, but if you look at it in slow motion, he does actually get lifted off the ground, and it looks like his fist is just flying with so much force that it pulls the rest of his body up. It's very subtle though. If I look at it at full scale and speed, I couldn't even necessarily tell you he was doing that. So it's again something that you feel more than necessarily consciously pick up on. And I like that. This is honestly doing everything it needs to. S tier. Ridley. So with these Dragonoid characters, right, your Charizards, your Ridleys, I absolutely understand the temptation to make the upwards facing attacks all use the wings, and to the team's credit, they did not do that for up smash. They found something much more distinctive for him to do. I just wish it felt more like something Ridley, the Metroid character, would actually do. It's widely speculated that Ridley's a character Sakurai was not particularly inspired by, not particularly thrilled to bring into Smash, and it's hard to blame people for having that opinion when you consider the fact that he was intentionally snubbed for Smash 4, and then in Ultimate, sure, he finally got brought in because there was just so much fan demand behind it, but when you look at how much of his moveset just doesn't really come across as something this character should necessarily be doing. Sometimes they capture that unsettling combination of feral predator and cunning pirate really well, and then other times they have him doing limp-looking acrobatics. Like, this is one of the biggest characters in the game slashing at you with massive talons. Why does it feel like it's just not gonna hurt that bad? There's nothing else that really helps the attacking foot spring off. It's the one leading the charge with all the momentum, and that can work if it looks like it's got a lot of force on its own. But this one really doesn't. Look at it, it's not moving that fast. To its credit, it's a very big attack, so that means that it's actually moving a little faster at the tip than it may appear at first glance. But still, the impression I get from this is more of a lazy swat out of the air, if anything. The whiff sound doesn't really have any danger behind it at all, and if you hit someone, it's better. Ridley's a big boy, so of course it has some heft behind it, but it still doesn't even feel like that much. Ridley has not had the best track record throughout this series, and I wish this was one of his better days, but it's an F tier. Bowser Jr. We've got this handstand into a propeller spin going on, and the thing about making your character's entire gimmick this cart that he's sitting in that's just absolutely stuffed with all sorts of gadgets is when you choose not to use them and just use what's already outwardly visible, it does take something away, right? If you are going to use the existing portion though, this is a fun way to do it. The handstand's a nice call. It's actually a one-handed handstand, which looks slightly awkward, honestly, but it's cartoony, it's fun, it's on a character like Bowser Jr., so it is still kind of fitting. I certainly prefer him doing gymnastics to Ridley, and I like how the cart gets all mean. That's a fun detail that a lot of his attacks have. The propeller itself, they really cheat with the scaling. It gets way bigger specifically for the attack, and it's got a pretty nice finisher on it too, and it's a finisher that you can actually notice if you hit someone. Again, they could probably make this a bit more memorable and fun by bringing out some kind of new, entirely unique gadget, but if you're gonna have the propeller in there somewhere, which I think is reasonable, up smash is a fair place to put it, and it's pretty well done. I think that's A tier. Rob. We've got another handstand going on here, this time a very stiff, kind of awkward looking one, but that's the entire point here, right? The actual attacking portion itself has some really nice recoil on that explosive hit. That's fun. It is brought down somewhat, though, by the fact that this flip he has to do to get into that position in the first place, though, is part of the attack, and it doesn't feel particularly naturally integrated. And the way the hit leg is doled out, those two portions of the attack, the flip and then that fiery launch, are given more or less equal emphasis, and that's not really working for me because this entire part here, up until the actual launch, feels awkward. It doesn't really feel like it should be doing much of anything. If we look at only the animation that starts from this point, great, that feels pretty nice. Looking at it at full gameplay scale and speed, it just comes across as busy. And also at full gameplay scale and speed, that nice launch actually is obscured quite a bit behind the flip down and just not really being held out for all that long. So the end result is, while this is quite a strong up smash, it doesn't really feel justified when I use it in practice. Like, yeah, if I look at only the very best highlighted portion of the move, this hit here is one of the strongest looking attacks period on any character, but that's not how this actually works, right? You don't look at little clippings from animations in a vacuum in slow motion. You have to look at what they actually contribute to combat, and Here, they don't manage to carry over anywhere near enough of that feeling. So unfortunately, that's going to be a C tier from me. The cunt. This is another animation that tells a bit of a story, right? Like with all of his smash attacks, you've got the off-screen dude shooting the NES zapper at them, and then they're frantically trying to get out of the way. I'd say it works fairly well for up smash. It doesn't feel too forced, but it's also just so quick that at full gameplay scale and speed, it's a little hard to necessarily tell exactly what's going on. At least during the first hit, it is much more obvious from the second and third one, because they actually hold that pose for a decent amount of time and it gets very exaggerated. The first hit is much more subdued, not held for very long, and the particle effect actually covers up part of their face. So that's a bit of a miss for me. And it's got the predictable problem where the character itself is not contributing anything to the attack, so how strong can it really look? And the answer is not particularly. Fun sound effects on it, but eh. Also, while the lip flapping on the dog is fun, what exactly is this chamber animation even supposed to be representing? I guess this is them putting their heads up extra high just so they have an excuse to bow out of the way afterwards. I don't know. C tier saved from F by the novel concept. Sonic, the first of the final 5. Sonic has way too many blue spheres in his moveset. Bold, original, daring take. I know, this is not a horrible application for it though. It is a move that actually tries to give Sonic some style, which a lot of his kit is shockingly lacking. Now, the spin in here is good, and it works perfectly fine if you put that pause in. If you don't and you just let it rip, that momentum does look a little strange. He starts going out one way and then just comes back the other without any proper overshoot that I think you would need to sell it. Right around here, his hips should keep going for a little bit and then come back the other way, I think. Although at full scale and speed, yeah, it's a quirk if you overanalyze it, but if viewed as intended, I don't think it really stands out. And I really like the landing animation on this one as well. He accelerates towards the ground unnaturally fast and hits it very hard. Even the getup has a little bit more weight behind it than a lot of these do. This chamber pose looks nice. It's actually got recognizable Sonic attitude behind it as well, and he dips down a lot. Wait, do I like a Sonic spinning animation? I mean, it does have that high-pitched, horrible, ear-splitting sound effect, but unlike something like this, it's not around for very long, and if you make contact, it's a tiny fraction of the animation length. I can't believe it, but I'm going S tier. I may never get this chance again. Olimar. Well, the party had to stop at some point. I've criticized Olimar's animations a lot for not looking like he's contributing anything to the attack. This is not the absolute worst example I've ever seen. He at least points with a little bit of authority that somewhat follows the line of action, but look at his arms. They can't even get close to rising above the helmet bubble. The silhouette is just an absolute catastrophe. The Pikmin stay so close to him, so it's not really helped there, and they hit quite hard, but it doesn't look like it whatsoever. The Pikmin latch onto his back before the strike. That's kind of fun, I guess, but if you look at it from this side, it just kind of seems almost more like random magnetism than some kind of conscious action. Is this a thing in Pikmin? I haven't played any in a while, and I haven't played the newer ones, but I don't remember being able to do this. I'm not sure. It doesn't sound horrible because it's just a rotating round of generic sound effects. But oh look, it's another Olimar F tier in the animation tier list series. Who could have seen that coming? Inkling. Funny that I got Rob on the random selection here because this motion is actually very reminiscent of it, that downwards propulsion, but much more emphasized and noticeable here. There's some heft as it comes up. Yeah, that is actually lingered on for a good amount of time. And then there's even a cool bit of a flip between the two weapons as one goes into the inventory and the splatter shot comes back out of the inventory. That's neat, actually. Does a bit of a kick to help move it along. That fits into the extreme sports vibe. On this side, yeah, even though it's behind Inkling's back and there's a big cloud of ink above them, it still shows up. That action is very noticeable. The chamber animation does not go particularly low. The Inkling could definitely be heaving that up a bit more, but the gun is huge and it travels in a very wide, dramatic arc, so it still comes across as fairly emphatic. Anything interesting happen if the tank is empty? No. Okay, that looks like a smash attack to me. It is stronger if you've got ink in there. You can't really tell the difference between the two of them because the sound effect between them's the same. There's no, you screwed up sound or no, you screwed up particle effect. It's an equally hard-hitting sound effect, meaning not very. That's a little funny. And this is one I've always thought had foot hitboxes on it. As it turns out, it does not. It does scoop them up from this side because you are hitting them with the gun barrel. And that's the area where I think the lack of a proper, really bent down heaving motion does show up, but it's still hefty feeling enough that, you know what? For the most part, okay, now that I'm looking at this, I can buy it. I still feel like they could pick up on that a little bit more, but it's really not bad. I'm a bit torn on this one because the core of the animation is like really good, but it's got those sticking points around the periphery, the refill thing, the scooping hitbox thing. I wish it sounded a bit better. It's a strong A, but unfortunately I think those are enough to keep it out of S. Plus, while it is using the ink, which is Inkling's obviously standout attribute, it's not doing anything particularly interesting with it. Alright, and then it was just the PK boys, starting with Lucas, and well, you can't say he doesn't commit. This is one of the most just straight up overkill up smashes in the entire game, and they got me. I really like this thing. He crouches quite low, and if you let it charge up, he ends up going down about as far as he realistically could, and then I really love this exaggerated hang time, the combination of him jumping and his psychic powers holding him up. I'm not really sure what's going on with the particle effects. They're kind of in front of and behind him at the same time as he's supposed to be surrounded by them. Okay, so they start to come out here. Yeah, okay, so one goes into him and the other behind. They're just kind of placed wherever the devs wanted from the looks of it. You know, it does look a little bit funny seeing them clip into him here, and they could have avoided that. I wish they did. But at full scale and speed, it doesn't last very long, and there's so much going on, and they move around so much inside the animation that I don't really care. And it does look like there was at least some effort to keep enough of them behind him to avoid it being completely obscuring. And the way they travel up is nicely done too. They look pretty floaty, but also still forceful the entire way up and a little bit mysterious and creepy looking, which is pretty appropriate for, you know, psychic powers. Sounds great when it whiffs. On hit. It does feel like it hits pretty hard. Again, I miss a little bit more of a sizzle behind it. I really think that would sell these magical attacks better. I know this isn't strictly a magical attack, but it's kind of treated as one. This is another attack that has some invincibility on it. It's not as associated with the move's identity as Bowser's shell, certainly, but some kind of visual indicator would be appreciated. And then we're just left with Ness, possibly my least favorite up smash in the entire game, entirely because of this stupid thing here. Or to be more precise, this stupid thing here. I think there is more to dislike about it beyond that, though. Yo-yo physics are weird, and on one hand, they did kind of capture it with this, how it seems to unnaturally be pulled along, but the end result is a very strong up smash that does not remotely feel like it. Look at this. While I do like the echo particle effect on it, it's so lethargic and casual looking. It shouldn't be able to do this by any standard. Also, the sound design's not really doing it for me. It does sound slightly yo-yo-y during the charge up portion, I guess. And while there is some amount of reeling sound in there, I guess, as he retracts it, honestly, they probably could have just slipped the Zero Suit Samus sound effect in there again, but there are a lot of ways to make, like, retracting strings sound great. This is not doing any of it. And while I like this steady hit sound, it doesn't sound appropriate for a yo-yo at all. So for Ness, I'm gonna let the yo-yo slip into C tier. And that's entirely on the back of the yo-yo being a fun weapon concept. Lucas, on the other hand, finishes very strong with an S tier. Any final adjustments I want to make? Okay, you know what? I'm gonna let Zelda climb back into S tier. They took a deliberately extremely weak looking animation and made it almost entirely work in the context of a character's strong moves. Yeah, I've got some gripes with it, but that is pretty cool. And for Dark Samus, I think this is actually gonna be the rare case where a clone gets elevated over the original. They did give it a different animation after all, and while I really can't see this attack working on Samus whatsoever, I can actually kind of buy it as a boss attack in a Metroid game. The casual nature does work better here. Alright, I think that'll do it. This has been the definitive Up Smash animation tier list. Thanks for watching, everyone. Not quite the spread I expected this time. Tell me what you thought. Likes and comments help out on YouTube's algorithm, so if you think it's warranted, much appreciated. You can check out another MockRock Talk video here, MockRock video below, and patrons, members, and subs get perks like early videos and Discord access. Later, people.